back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyakin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. The Israeli operation into Gaza City is in full swing as of this recording. They're advancing into the city. They're issuing evacuation orders. The Christians are refusing to evacuate. We're going to get into that in a second. But despite apparently they're going to be bombing, I guess the warnings include they're going to be bombing the St. Porphyrios and Holy Family Catholic Church compounds in Gaza City as they advance. But those have been some of the most charitable, the people, the nuns and the priests and the Christians living there have been caring for some of the people in Gaza City more than anybody else. So they can't leave. But the Israelis are recovering dead hostages. They're killed, they're blowing up their own hostages in these strikes, recovering the bodies, advancing intensely. Smotrich is calling for the full annexation of the Gaza Strip. So we're going to break down exactly as that genocide is escalating, what's going on there. New calls for West Bank annexation are ongoing as well. Tom Barak had some interesting comments about Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. We're going to be discussing all these peripheral regions, especially Syria, as the SDF continues to resist integration with Damascus. Turkey calling for an offensive from Damascus into SNF territory as Israel continues to arm the Druze and advance militarily on the ground deeper and deeper into Syria. Settlers as well advancing into Syria. So Syria continuing to disintegrate in many ways. But Israel also struck Damascus, striking many Turkish observation points and data gathering centers. So the big escalation this week was between Turkey and Israel. Turkey is now supposedly, at least it claims to have restricted its airspace from Israeli jets and is now preventing all Turkish ships from docking at Israeli ports and vice versa. We're going to scrutinize some of these claims, whether or not this is really happening or not. But then we, of course, need to move on to the Iran situation as the snapback sanctions have been activated from the E3 there. We're going to be discussing Netanyahu's recognition of the Greek-Armenian genocide by Turkey and how that obviously overlaps with the growing conflict between the two states, Israel and Turkey. We're then going to quickly move over to Russia. Obviously, the front line is advancing rapidly in Russia's favor, despite the fact that negotiations seem to be going absolutely nowhere. Friedrich Merz is claiming there's not going to be any Zelensky-Putin meeting. Trump is approving long-range missiles being sent to Ukraine. So things are going very much in the wrong direction there, but not particularly surprising to us here at World War Now. We're going to obviously also discuss what's going on in Venezuela. Trump and his cabinet apparently claiming that even strikes, like missile strikes on Venezuela, are on the table as far as confronting Maduro goes. We're going to be discussing the school shooting in the United States and now the apparent, Gideon Zog panopticon, Minority Report pre-crime online scouring mechanism that's going to be deployed, in the name of fighting against school shootings. We're going to be discussing Africa. We're going to be discussing China's massive military parade that's about to occur. And of course, we're going to wrap things up with some church news, as there's always some important things going on in the church this week. So with all that being said, Dmitry, how are you doing? Big week this week.
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. And I suppose before we discuss the big news coming out of Turkey, Anatolia, and the reactions to Israel's imminent, and some people say already commenced Operation Gideon's Chariot Part 2, in Gaza City, this continuation of the genocide and a huge escalation of it. I think it's important to just give a snapshot on what's happening in the Holy Land in Palestine at the moment. A few days ago, there was a raid on the city of Nablus. So this is the third largest city in the West Bank. Of course, Palestinian held, lots of Christians living there, especially in the old city of Nablus. So the Israelis sent 2,000 soldiers, and these are not police officers, not SWAT, not some sort of Homeland Security equivalent, not even FBI. These are straight up Israeli IDF army soldiers undertook an operation. And to do what, you may think? What are they doing in Nablus in the West Bank, in this relatively peaceful, very old, museum-heavy area of the city? Well, they were raiding cash converters. They were raiding Palestinian ATMs at 3 a.m. at night, emptying them, also attacking various shops, searching the shops for I suppose anti-Israeli propaganda. And of course, fortunately for the Palestinians in Nablus, not a single Palestinian was killed in the action. Some were pretty grievously injured, of course, via Israeli grenades that were thrown into the shops. Early on, there were Palestinians still opening up their shops when, of course, a grenade goes through the window, blows up, flashbangs, etc. So the Israelis are undertaking these huge demoralization strikes against the Palestinians in the West Bank. Notice, you don't ever see an IDF raid such as this on a questionable Israeli Zionist settlement anywhere, on some of these villages which literally commit violent acts against their Palestinian neighbors, right, as they expand these illegal settlements in the West Bank. But on Palestinian cities, yes. And even the governor of Nablus said he had no idea what was going on, but he could not get the local Palestinian Authority or any of the local police officers or militiamen to stop the Israeli army because they're simply too heavily armed. 2,000 men, that's an entire battalion worth. And yes, so this is what's happening in the West Bank at the moment. Notice at the same time, the results of this, the Israelis said that they're not going to disclose what has come of this. They withdrew apparently 1.5 million shekels, which is roughly $500,000 American dollars from the ATMs and cash converters, and then left. So these raids, completely unannounced, are taking place all over the West Bank. They have been since the 7th of October. And the death toll in the West Bank, many don't appreciate, actually. All the eyes are on Gaza. But in the West Bank itself, since October 7th, there's been over 900 Palestinians killed. And I think people of other nationalities as well in the small minority. So these are Christians and Muslims alike. It's very interesting how Israel is fighting a multi-pronged war against all of the native populace on either side of the divided Palestinian landscape. So what we're seeing at the moment in Gaza City is the Israelis are preparing for the final strike against the Hamas outpost. I think they suspect, or at least the propaganda is being put out, and Netanyahu is having all these fake meetings with his leadership and members of international delegations that they believe the majority of the hostages are being held somewhere underground below Gaza City. And so in order to withdraw them, because Hamas apparently doesn't want to come to the negotiating table, the Israelis have to move in militarily. And to do so, they, of course, are opening up these so-called humanitarian exodus corridors out of Gaza City. They're telling everyone to leave, right, to go further south, because Gaza City, of course, is located more towards the northeastern end of the Gaza Strip. So you could say, closer to Ashkelon as opposed to close to the Egyptian border. So it's very interesting to see the Israelis really put their foot down on the gas. And I think this would explain the agitation in Europe. Everyone is preparing for more atrocities, for a huge escalation point. And yes, we've all seen footage over the last month of starving Palestinian children, men, women as well, people dying of malnutrition. This is a common theme. But what we're going to witness, I think, very soon, and literally as of 10 to 12 hours since the recording of this episode on the 29th of August, we're already seeing long-range heavy bombardment of Gaza City, almost in preparation for what the Israelis are going to commence this week in the Operation Gideon's Chariot to cleanse the city of Hamas fighters and to apparently retrieve the bodies of the so-called 7th of October hostages, as well as the actual living hostages themselves. And interestingly enough, it all commenced with apparently Israeli special forces already from Gaza City withdrew the body of one hostage. And coincidentally, his name was Elon, but Ilan Weiss was his name. So they apparently have already achieved the minor victory. So the Israelis are very proud of themselves as they, of course, bomb and kill 50 to 100 Palestinians per day across the entire Gaza landscape. So it's quite horrible. And I think, Conrad, generally speaking, we are going to see many Middle Eastern countries finally, I think, react to the atrocities, especially as they escalate. We're going to see, I think, the Gulf states, even certain ones like Saudi Arabia, who really, they haven't normalized of Israel per se. They've been sitting on the sidelines throughout this entire genocide. They've been watching 60 to 100,000 to maybe some people estimate 200,000 Palestinians die without a proper reaction. But I think as soon as the Gaza City siege commences, and we know the Palestinians are not leaving their homes, we know there's the UN estimates as many as 1 million Palestinians may be in danger as soon as the siege commences. But I think easily hundreds and thousands of Palestinians are going to be hurt, damaged by whatever takes place in this next, I would say, 1 to 2 weeks when Israel, of course, pushes the gas pedal. So many countries will react. We're already seeing very aggressive statements of deterrence from Iran, from the Yemeni Houthis, and we're seeing even Turkey posturing in a very interesting position, almost as if none of these Sunni Muslim countries want to receive the blame for standing on the sidelines and allowing this atrocity to take place. And yes, the US, Israel's greatest ally at the moment, is not saying anything to stop this. So the Trump administration is entirely and completely behind Netanyahu, but we'll speak about that in a moment.
Yes, as of today, Israel has declared a pause on all, not really a pause, an end to all pauses on combat in Gaza City and the entire north part of the Gaza Strip. It's entirely becoming a combat zone now. They're going to be advancing deep in there. As of now, I've seen massive plumes of smoke all over the city. It almost looks like some of the early days of the worst bombings of Gaza City, right? In the immediate few weeks aftermath of October 7th. Of course, Hamas is still putting up a fight. There was a report today that apparently 4 IDF soldiers could have even been taken hostage. They are taking very heavy casualties. That's why the IDF has had to mobilize 60,000 new troops to become reservists, and putting reservists then into active combat. This new operation is likely going to take a heavy toll on the IDF and have a very strong loss of life, which people are sort of forgetting that in the midst of all of this, Hamas is still operational, and they are taking a lot of Israeli lives. And Israel is not a massive country. They're a population of, 5 to 6 million people or so, and they cannot afford to take these massive military losses, especially if they're going to continue to expand their, current civilizational war into Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. They're bombing the Houthis now. We're going to talk about that in a second. So, as much as it's obvious that Gaza, the Palestinian people, have thoroughly lost, and we're going to talk about the Palestine UN General Assembly situation here in a second, it's not so clear that the Israelis are going to come out of this in one piece, as it were. But this is from the AP. It said Hamas says it's ready for Gaza City combat, will try to keep hostages alive. Abu Obeida, spokesman for Hamas's armed wing, said its fighters were on high alert and prepared to confront Israeli troops in Gaza City. He said the group would try to keep its hostages alive, but that they are being held in areas where fighting is expected. And as I said earlier, the remains of 2 of the hostages were found by the IDF, which I'm assuming that means they bombed wherever they were being held, and they died, and they were then found. So it's clear that Netanyahu he effectively said it, that the recovery of the hostages was not the number one priority, and he didn't say this by exactly, but it's clear that they have no interest in caring about the hostages. And if anything, they would probably be happy if more hostages get taken so they can continue to propagandize certain Israeli people that, they may be Jewish supremacists and Zionist genocide supporters, but publicly speaking, they would much prefer to say that, oh, I just support the return of the hostages, we just this, that, or the other. That appeals to the sort of deceptively bleeding heart Jewish person that has to lie and claim that they're not really a ethno-religious supremacist. They're actually just they just worry about the hostages, right? And that's sort of the entire utility of that. Obviously, Hamas knows it's all they can really do as far as something to bargain with and negotiate with. So I understand why they do it. But this idea that Israelis or high-level Jews care about a few small Jews getting killed along the way to their greater Israel Antichrist project, I laugh. What a ridiculous thing, right? But at this point, the Orthodox and Latin Jerusalem patriarchates, this is from Ortho Christian, they warned of the imminent Gaza City offensive, and they vow to remain with the civilians. The Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem and the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem issued a joint statement yesterday expressing grave concern over Israel's announced plans to take control of Gaza City, warning that mass evacuations and military preparations signal an imminent offensive. They report that evacuation orders have already been issued for several neighborhoods in Gaza City, accompanied by heavy bombardment causing further destruction and death. The patriarchates emphasize that their compounds, the Orthodox compound of St. Porphyrius and the Holy Family compound, have sheltered hundreds of civilians since the war's outbreak, including elderly people, women, children, and people with disabilities, cared for by the Sisters Missionaries of Charity. Leaving Gaza City and trying to flee to the south would be nothing less than a death sentence, the statement declares, explaining why clergy and nuns have decided to remain and continue caring for those seeking refuge. The patriarchate calls for an immediate end to the violence, stating there is no reason to justify the deliberate and forcible mass displacement of civilians. They appeal to the international community to act to end what they termed a senseless and destructive war, while also calling for the return of missing people and Israeli hostages. The statement concludes with a prayer for conversion of hearts so that we may walk in the paths of justice and life for Gaza and for the whole Holy Land. So, again, all eyes are going to be on the Christian little area within Gaza City where, again, they've already tried to destroy the cross with a tank at the Catholic Church. They already destroyed the church hall and killed dozens of people, including children, at St. Porphyrios Orthodox Church, the 3rd oldest Christian church in the world. So at a certain level, they may just say, screw it, we've already lost. The U.S. is siding with us. Trump backs us. They've already denied the Palestinian Authority their visas to go to the General Assembly. We'll stick with Washington and the U.S. over France and Canada and the U.K. and these other countries that plan on recognizing Palestine. What are they going to recognize? Palestine won't exist in a month and a half. By the time they are even potentially voting on this, Palestine won't exist, especially with what you were talking about, Nablus, Dimitri. They're moving on the West Bank and Gaza as fast as they can so that what happens with this vote, whatever, the worldwide consensus sort of becomes as Palestine, the last few countries that won't recognize Palestine emerge, namely the United States. Israel's trying to make sure Palestine is completely dismantled before any kind of consciousness shift occurs regarding the world map and borders and 1967. And we know Saudi Arabia is very much behind this because I give Saudi Arabia some credit. They're, unlike a lot of these other countries, they're at least demanding there's some kind of Palestinian state before they recognize Israel, even if besides that, they are very much Shabbos Goyim. But with all that, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ongoing Gaza genocide. Like you said, more than 75 Palestinians are dying of starvation every 24 hours, it seems, right now. I'm sure we have no accurate numbers on the real civilian death toll, which we know is around 83% of all dead in Gaza are entirely innocent and have nothing to do with any kind of actual conflict going on between these two entities. So, quite the horrible situation. We have to pray for everyone involved.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the most surprising thing that since October 7th, and we've really covered this, was Egypt's reaction to the entire October 7th Gaza Strip operation. It's unclear what role Egypt will play in the, shall we say, climax, the ending of this particular genocide. Is Egypt actually provide some sort of humanitarian respite for the Palestinian refugees in the Sinai Peninsula? Or is Egypt simply there to not allow so-called Muslim Brotherhood Hamas fighters to cross into the Egyptian territory to cause a ruckus in their territory? Because you have to keep in mind, in Egyptian prisons right now, there's a lot of religious and political prisoners who are, let's just say, they have ties to organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, people somewhat related to Osama bin Laden in the past. So Egypt is very much anti-Islamist in its stance. So we can't sort of view Egypt as necessarily an ally of Hamas. But whether or not the Egyptian people feel some sort of affinity for the regular Palestinian folks who aren't members of Hamas, who are just simply suffering and being bombed by the Israelis, I think they will. I think going back to the wars of the 1960s and 70s, I think the regular Egyptian doesn't have any liking towards Israel. I mean, you have to keep in mind, Israel back in the day destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force, right, with sort of preemptive airstrike raids. So the relationship between Egypt and Israel at the moment, it really is walking a fine line, simply balancing on the particular consideration of American aid being provided for Egypt in order to keep the Suez Canal open and for global trade to flow smoothly as possible. So it'll be very interesting to see how Egypt reacts to what's taking place. And we know Egypt has been ramping up the forces, stationed in the Sinai Peninsula, including tanks, anti-air missile systems, etc. So it's very, very interesting to see how all of that develops. But generally speaking, Conrad, I think what we've been seeing is the absolute stance of the Donald Trump administration. We have to say this somewhat condemningly as well. Marco Rubio, obviously, we knew this character was a neocon, a Zionist, but he's proven to be absolutely the watchdog of Israel, more than Anthony Blinken. And Anthony Blinken was ethnically Jewish as well, so that's quite surprising. We saw that recently from the Netanyahu interview of Patrick Bet-David, when Netanyahu tried to portray the Biden administration as somewhat anti-Israeli, right? And he says, well, I have a long-standing relationship with Donald J. Trump, and Biden really tried to be forceful with us through Anthony Blinken, etc. Very interesting position, but we know this is most likely just smoke and mirrors from Netanyahu. Clearly, Biden did give him the green light for the entire Gaza Strip operation. Yes, Biden may have, out of principle, opposed the West Bank settlements from expanding, etc. But Donald J. Trump clearly is very much interested in whatever future Gaza may have without Hamas and without radical Palestinians occupying it. I mean, he wants to turn the Gaza Strip into some sort of Californian coastline, Miami, who knows what kind of plans and operations he may have. He's already postured and said as much on Truth Social. But actually, practically speaking, the very, I would say, surprising move has been the world's preparation for the UN General Assembly taking place this year. So typically, since the late 1940s, the UN General Assemblies, these are annual meetings in New York at the United Nations headquarters. They typically take place in the middle of September. And sometimes, depending on what's on the agenda, how many countries have speeches to give, how many proposals there are, these big diplomatic meetings last from the middle of September until almost Christmas time, until the Christmas break. So almost 3 months at a time, sometimes 4 or 5 months. So very sort of busy occasion. And we have to keep in mind that this year, I think, given the death toll escalation, the failures of the Trump administration early on from stopping any sort of peace between Hamas and the IDF. And when we know Trump has just tried to, through Steve Witkoff, to sit both parties at the table, there'll be a lot of discussion of the Palestinian genocide. And in order to thwart, again, the Palestinian position from being spoken out, and it's not like there's going to be a Hamas representative in New York in September speaking about this. No. The U.S., through Marco Rubio, through the U.S. State Department, has denied visa access for members of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, so the Palestinian Liberation Organization. These are two oppositionary groups to Hamas, mostly active. Yes, they have members in the Gaza Strip, but mostly they're active and they hold a lot of authority in those West Bank cities, Ramallah, Hebron, Jenin, Bethlehem, Nablus, and in the entire West Bank. This is to whom, of course, most of them, they adhere to Mahmoud Abbas, the leader who we spoke about many times in our show. This is the not anti-Israeli, I wouldn't even say anti-Zionist. He's the leader of the Palestinians of the West Bank who is very much looking for normalization. He does hold this position of a two-state solution, but he, of course, doesn't have this same position as Hamas, where the Hamas basically say from the river to the sea, all of Palestine has to be free. He doesn't have that stance. He just wants to coexist with the Israelis and to give Palestinians incrementally more rights as sort of the liberation and suppose the freedom-loving movement progresses in Israel. And so that's his hope. And of course, we know he's supported heavily by BRICS, by Russia, China, and Mahmoud Abbas's visa has been denied by Marco Rubio. So the US at the moment, and not just him, but 80 other Palestinian and pro-Palestinian members, mostly from that area, they've been denied access to New York to enter the United States. And these are people not associated with any terrorist organizations, not Hezbollah, not Hamas, no other. Of course, we have to just comment on Trump's. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if there's members of the Syrian delegation at the UN this year, right? At the General Assembly, members of former HDS, right? These people with a strong past, as per Donald J. Trump, because that would really show us this two-faced approach. And I think why, Conrad, is because Marco Rubio, Trump, they're just trying to protect their image. They're trying to protect their buddy Netanyahu. Trump himself has said that if Netanyahu was an American citizen, he would pardon him and he would give him clemency. Like, he's clearly taking a very strong stance on supporting Israel until the very end. Operation Midnight Hammer was just an example of that. Trump risked a regional massive conflict. He risked the closing of the Straits of Hormuz over what? Over one sovereign nation having essentially a limited battle with another, right? Long-range bombardment, which we've seen many times between Iraq and Israel in the past in the 1990s. So it's just very interesting how far the US has come in order to support the regime at the moment in Israel, the Likud party specifically, because there are peace-loving Israelis, so to speak. There are like Israeli hipsters, most of them, of course, are very like LGBTQ aligned. The people still protesting in Israel, by the way, in cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv. These are not the people who Marco Rubio and Trump seem to be going after here. They are very supportive of the militaristic side, the people in charge of Israel at the moment, the people in charge of the IDF. And, at the moment, there are UN officials actually disputing the cancellation of these visas. Officially, Stephanie Jurakic, Serbian representative of the UN, she's a UN spokesperson. She said that she's looking into the fact that Palestinians won't be able to attend the UN General Assembly. And my hope is that some of these BRICS nations, the Prime Minister of India perhaps, Xi Jinping, President Putin, I think they have to comment on the fact that there needs to be Palestinian voices heard about, on the main stage of the UN. And yes, we're very skeptical about the UN's general position. Like, this is a post-World War II consensus creation. It's a very interesting forum, I think, the results of which we have to just mention how many fruits has the UN brought about since the beginning of the Cold War, the end of the Second World War. Probably not that many, right? They've witnessed many genocides. They've stopped almost none of them. And generally speaking, it's a very limited forum of discussion. But at the very least, I think it could bring the Palestinian issue more to the attention of other nations who are perhaps less involved, African, Asiatic nations who are very disconnected. There's no cultural or religious links to Palestine, and they perhaps care very little about it in terms of their daily news. They're not even as online and looking at what's happening in the Middle East as much as, say, we Christians, people of Muslim backgrounds, and even I would say Talmudic Zionists who are very interested and invested in the current stakes of the Eastern Mediterranean landscape and geopolitical struggle there. So it's just a shame, really, Conrad, that the Trump administration, despite all our hopes in November and, of course, the inauguration in January, really it's been failing on almost every single angle. And yes, the posturing is very interesting, the posturing against migrants, but even that, I think it's all been a big salesman tactic to get us on board and to get people online on board for a conservative presidency, which just turns out to be very philo-Semitic and very pro-Zionist, to the point where I don't think there's been a more pro-Zionist president since the beginning of the United States, since the creation of Israel itself.
Unfortunately, Trump has admitted as much himself, so people couldn't get offended by that or deny it because Trump proudly wears the label. And unfortunately, we saw Itamar Ben-Gvir visiting the state of Georgia. Very unfortunate to see, especially as Georgia moves closer into the Russian sphere of influence. It's unfortunate to see that there are people in the Russian world, the Eurasian world, the sort of multipolar world that are totally fine with religious Zionism. And of course, speaking of religious Zionism, that is the name of Smotrich's party. And he recently reiterated in the Knesset and in the cabinet that he believes the only acceptable plan for Gaza is to, as he says, we will occupy Gaza and make it an inseparable part of Israel. They have to starve and dehydrate Hamas fighters to death. And we know that Smotrich considers everybody in Palestine a Hamas fighter. So he's saying full genocide. His plan involves, the gradual annexation of areas of the Gaza Strip and reduction of the enemy's territory and implementation of the Trump plan for voluntary emigration of the Strip's residents. So he's just openly calling for the genocide and the relocation of all of the Palestinians. And again, this is the finance minister of Israel, so not exactly an irrelevant guy. And as you said, Dimitri, Mahmoud Abbas, these Palestinians have had their visas revoked for the upcoming UN General Assembly, which is a massive escalation to the point where, unfortunately, I have no expectations. I would bet money that this won't happen. But if these other countries had any balls, particularly Russia, China, and frankly, in particular at this point, France, the UK, Canada, Portugal, these countries that plan on recognizing Palestine, they should protest. I mean, they should, in some ways, they should be calling for the UN to be relocated outside of New York City. They should be calling for the UN to be moved to Switzerland, or the UN to be moved to Guyana Essequibo, or you should be, or not Guyana Essequibo, or French Guyana, or for it to be moved to, I don't know, Bhutan or one of these places where it could be called more neutral than what's going on in New York, where the Jewish influence is clearly just too strong in the United States, both in New York City itself and the federal government and in the diplomatic world bureaucracy right now, because they refuse to even allow the recognized Palestinian observer state that is a part of the United Nations. They're not allowing them to come to the General Assembly, meaning it is not a General Assembly because the General Assembly is not invited because the Palestinian observers are part of that. Sure, they don't vote, but what does it matter that they can't vote? The General Assembly votes are non-binding anyway. So this idea that they're not a real member, none of these countries are real members. The only members that matter are the Security Council. And it doesn't matter that the members that matter are the Security Council and Israel, because Israel controls many of the countries on the Security Council. And besides that, everybody else is just sort of pawns in the chess game of those larger powers. And we'll be covering it extensively on the World War Now social medias, everything that's going on, of course, with the General Assembly. But we have to keep moving on here. We have to move on to Syria and Lebanon. I want to read the recent comments from Tom Barak, the U.S. envoy for Syria, as well as the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. This from Middle East Eye. He says, Israel sees Sykes-Picot borders as meaningless. U.S. envoy Tom Barak says Lebanese armed forces will not disarm Hezbollah and Syria will not join the Abraham Accords. Israel is not interested in adhering to the Middle East's established borders set by the World War I Sykes-Picot Agreement and has the capacity or the desire to take over Lebanon and Syria, according to Special Envoy Tom Barak. Barak made this assessment in an astonishing and candid interview with online personality Mario Nawfal, which went online late on Thursday. It was just one of many insights that Barak, who is at the center of U.S. diplomacy in the region, shared. In addition, he said that Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa will not sign the Abraham Accords with Israel and alluded to deeply strained ties between Egypt and Israel, which he said are no longer talking to each other or cooperating. Barak is the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, but has become Trump's envoy to the wider Eastern Mediterranean and the Caucasus. A billionaire real estate investor, Barak, like his boss at the White House, has chafed at the traditional U.S. foreign policy establishment, including its preference for maintaining quiet ties with American establishment media. Instead, he's given shoot-from-the-hip style interviews. On Thursday, he called himself an events-driven mercenary. What's going on in Gaza makes the rest of the Arab world totally freaked out, Barak said. In Israel's mind, these lines that were created by Sykes-Picot are meaningless. They will go wherever they want, when they want, and do what they want to protect the Israelis and their borders, Barak said. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a secret agreement between Britain and France struck in 1916 during World War I that divided the Ottoman Empire's territories in the Levant, fashioning the modern-day states of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Mandatory Palestine, the wide swath of land that was later partitioned to create Israel. Barak visited Beirut this week as part of efforts to disarm Hezbollah and has been mediating talks between Syria and Israel. Pressed on whether Israel would conquer Lebanon or Syria, Barak said he did not mean Israel wants to take over its neighbors, but will act against its foes. Does Israel have the capacity or the desire to really take over Lebanon? Absolutely. Why didn't they take it? They have the capacity to do the same thing in Syria, he said. The idea that Israel is really interested in keeping everybody off balance so that they can have more control and command, in my opinion, just as an individual, is ludicrous, he said. Barak is attempting to mediate a deal by which Hezbollah surrenders its heavy weaponry to the Lebanese armed forces. Lebanon wants Israel to withdraw from the south of the country and for reconstruction funds to flow in from the oil-rich Gulf as part of this deal. Israel severely degraded Hezbollah's capacities following Hamas-led October 7th attacks. Barak, whose grandparents emigrated to the U.S. from Lebanon, said he made a personal appeal to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during a meeting this week as a man with Lebanese blood. I'm asking you, Netanyahu, to do something that I know will do you well and do Jews all over the world well. Give Lebanon a break. Give them a whiff of tolerance. You can't be apparently so brutal on everybody, going anywhere, anytime you want. It's going to backfire. Barak and Netanyahu agreed but did not provide specifics. 2 Lebanese soldiers were killed by an Israeli drone on Thursday. Israel apologized for the strike, calling it a technical malfunction. And of course, we've recently expressed Naim Qasem's opinions in his recent speeches on the show that Hezbollah will not be disarmed and that it could trigger a Lebanese civil war if Lebanon continues to attempt to disarm them, which is probably part of why Barak and the Lebanese are now focusing again on Israel because they realize, what would be better, to actually have a Lebanese civil war again, which is horrible, or to actually just look at Israel, this pariah state that is invading us, and actually try to push them back, which makes a lot of sense. And this was, frankly, some of the most anti-Israel rhetoric I've heard from a U.S. official, frankly, ever. And it still was, of course, entirely couched in being pro-Israel. He still said that he thinks Israel as a destabilizing agent is ludicrous, which, how can you even say that? There's no more greater example of a destabilizing agent in any region, or frankly in the world, than Israel, because Israel destabilizes both its region and the world in so many different ways that the only reason you can believe otherwise is if you are in on the lie and in on the deal to help create greater Israel. But there have been major Israeli airstrikes on Syria. 6 soldiers killed one day. I believe another day had 10 soldiers killed in their airstrikes. Israel was sending major amounts of helicopters into southern Syria, the Druze and Asweda regions, likely rearming these new Druze militias that we discussed in our previous episodes, which are continuing to call for autonomy, continuing to call for separatism, some even continuing to want to join up with Israel. Israeli settlers are continuing to flow into the Mount Hermon region and others, and Israel continues to even operate ground operations, expanding the current territory that, again, they say they don't want to annex it one day. They say they do want to annex it another day. They say they want to have negotiations with al-Sharaa another day. And then today, they're bombing Damascus heavily, and they're directly destroying Turkish operational facilities, Turkish observation zones, Turkish monitoring technology. And for that reason, as we're going to discuss in a second, Turkey has, for like the 3rd or 4th time, reiterated that they're now like cutting all trade and air ties with Israel. And this is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. From yesterday, following up on the deadly Israeli drone strikes against Kishwa, which killed 6 people I mentioned earlier. In the southern part of the metro of Damascus, Israel conducted an overnight raid of an old air base there, with dozens of IDF troops arriving via helicopters and spending over 2 hours in the base. The troops landed at a hilltop near Jabal al-Manea, which was an air base with an Iranian presence before the fall of the Assad government last year. The new Syrian army has a presence at the site now, though it appears they were chased off by Israeli drone strikes ahead of the raid, and Israeli warplanes kept them from returning. It's not clear what the Israeli troops were actually doing at the base, though it had been reported that some old Iranian weapons may have been left there. The IDF has declined to comment on the operation, saying their policy is to not comment on foreign media reports. Yesterday's drone strikes killed 8 Syrian soldiers, though there hasn't been an Israeli explanation for the attacks. Syrian media suggested that the Syrian troops had found some Israeli surveillance devices at the site and were dismantling them at the time of the strikes. It's possible the last night's ground raids were related to those devices. Meanwhile, other Israeli officials suggested that they were there to dismantle Turkish surveillance devices that had been there for over a decade. The official warned that Turkey was trying to get closer to Israel more than it should. Israel also warned Syria not to test its patience. Israel was carrying out airstrikes on Syria throughout the country's civil war, and after the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham took power in December, Israel invaded more or less immediately, seizing the demilitarized zone and eventually going deeper into Syria's southwest. Negotiations between Israel and HTS are ongoing, not to end the state of war, but to try to slightly reduce the level of hostility. Since deeper invasions are going on concurrent with that, as well as deadly Israeli drone strikes, the talks likely face an uphill battle. And of course, besides the southwest of Turkey, the biggest escalations in the region have to do with the SDF and what's going on in the Kurdish region in the northeast of the country. And this is from Abu Omar Adleb, who is the head of the SDF. I can't remember if he's the spokesman or the head of it, but he said, and this is someone who is representing someone who commands 100,000 troops in Syria. He says Turkey has exhausted all its cards with the government. It has only one path left. General Maslum Abdi, who is He is the commander of the SDF. A new stage is at the doorstep, pregnant with surprises and transformations. And there's rumors that the SDF is preparing to defend itself against a October offensive from the Damascus government, primarily led by Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, SNA, forces with the goal of taking Deir ez-Zor. I think we discussed this last week, but unfortunately there hasn't seemed to be any progress in negotiation integrating the SDF or any of these other groups. And this is from Sina Tosi on X. It's a bunch of different articles combined. It says, is Turkey moving from symbolic protests against Israel to actual sanctions and preparation for long-term rivalry? Because obviously Turkey is trying to unite all of these sort of fractious regions, reunite the SDF in with Damascus, get all these oil-rich regions and the Kurdish regions, and obviously it would help Turkey to dismantle more Kurdish supply lines. Obviously they want the Druze to be integrated into the country and Israel to be pushed back. So right now Turkey standing strong with Syrian integration under the new 3-star Damascus flag, with Israel seeking to, seemingly at least, able to benefit the most from Syria remaining balkanized. This says Ankara is now reportedly even building nationwide bomb shelters, something many in Iran criticized their own government for neglecting when war broke out with Israel. So the indication or the implication here being that Turkey potentially realizes that they might fall under Israeli airstrikes sometime soon. So then a few different headlines here from TRT World. It says Turkey reaffirms full trade halt with Israel, ban ships from docking at Israeli ports. Turkey has reaffirmed its full suspension of trade with Israel, with the Turkish foreign minister announcing that Turkish ships will no longer be allowed to dock at Israeli ports, and Israeli aircraft will be denied access to Turkish airspace. Speaking at an extraordinary session of Turkish parliament on Friday, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan accused Israel of committing crimes in Gaza that he described as one of the darkest chapters in human history. Israel has for 2 years been committing the crime of genocide in Gaza, disregarding basic human values before the eyes of the world, Fidan said. He added that Palestinians' resistance against Israel would alter the course of history, become a symbol for the oppressed, and shake the foundations of a decaying order. And again, this is a lot of rhetoric. We hear from Erdogan, we hear from Hakan Fidan, we hear from other Turkish officials talking about how much they stand with Palestine. Because again, they have an easier time. There's always been a Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas connection with Turkey and their Islamist Erdogan government. So politically speaking, it's been very easy for them to stand with Gaza. But unfortunately, despite the fact that he's claiming they've cut off all their trade with Israel, within an hour of this happening and these announcements, multiple Turkish Shadow Fleet ships were docking in Haifa, and Israeli planes were seen to be flying over eastern Turkey and advancing to Europe and elsewhere. So I don't know if it was, on a fuse, if we're going to see this, snap into action in the next few days, but it seems that it wasn't an immediate something that was immediately implemented following the foreign minister's speech there. But Dimitri, I would love to hear your thoughts on everything going on in Syria, particularly with this Turkish angle, because this escalation is big, and we've talked for a long time about how the Turkish-Israeli relation, as it goes from being sort of a dormant thing to being real, how that will potentially affect, the prophecies, the Russo-Turkish war to come, and, the potential 80-year curse with Israel, and of course the fall of Erdogan, which again, if Israel and Turkey become real enemies, I could easily see Israel pushing and behind the scenes causing Erdogan to fall, assassinating him in any other way, causing his party to come out of power, which would, I believe, escalate tensions in all other aspects of World War III, which is probably part of why, Netanyahu, in their confrontation with Turkey, he went on Patrick Bet-David, and he's now recognizing the Armenian genocide, all these sorts of things. So all of that in mind, I know I just said a lot. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the developing situation here.
Yeah, I think I'm quite cautious of the potential Turkish war that will eventually come, as per the prophecies, especially of the Greek elders. And we can sort of see Turkey's positioning against both Greece, both Greek Cyprus, and again, the posturing, at least systemically, against Israel. And also Israel's alliance with Greece, right? The sort of warm relationships they have. We know that there are many offshore facilities, and some people even claim there are straight up Israeli spy bases operating in Greek Cyprus. And I think the Turks are very well aware of all of this. And the interesting posturing, not just from Hakan Fidan, but also from Erdogan recently. This is from the 27th of August. Erdogan actually appeared at a parade of anti-air defense systems. So there were 47 vehicles, right, worth close to $500 million American. And apparently there's a whole radar system set up along we have to just assume it's the western and southern border of Turkey, which apparently will scan for long-range missiles, drones, as well as enemy planes flying into Turkish airspace, which can then be shot down by a mix of Turkish air defense systems. And of course, these air defense systems consist of sort of older Cold War era air defense launchers, and of course, perhaps, of course, less powerful than the THAAD or the Patriot systems that America has, or that America has even proposed providing to Ukraine and has given to Israel. However, Turkey has acquired, and we know this from its 2016-2017 purchase, a certain S-400 air defense system launchers, and these are allegedly launchers which can reach and scan for stealth fighters, right? So this is something that Iran did not have in their retinue, in their arsenal, when, of course, Operation Midnight Hammer took place, and you had U.S. stealth fighters flying over Iranian territory and completely unannounced, just sort of in the middle of the night, hence the name Operation Midnight Hammer, without any threat from Iranians actually shooting them down. But Turkey is just looking to secure its airspace, potentially for that future war against both Greece, Greek Cyprus, and maybe even an allied Israel. Again, this is a very hypothetical scenario, and God forbid, Conrad, that the future war against Turkey, which is maybe why the saints have been somewhat vague as to if this war will be one of orthodoxy against Islam. Well, notice how these details aren't really provided to us, because perhaps this geopolitical conflict wherein they claim that blood will flow and there'll be a huge loss of life within Anatolia, maybe it'll take place, or at least it'll commence under the pretext not of some sort of Christian liberation of formerly Christian lands, but under the pretext of very vague and, I would say, hyper-Machiavellian political interest, geopolitically speaking. So maybe Russia and Israel, for example, will align against Turkey for the first time in their history, right? And I know this sounds somewhat strange, but we do see clearly Israel and Greece's alliance against Turkey really solidify at this point, and also the US's ban on Turkish purchases of F-35 stealth fighters. Clearly, the US is very interested. And yes, the initial pretext for the US ban of Lockheed Martin sales of F-35 stealth fighters to Turkey was that, well, you cannot have both S-400 air defense systems and F-35 fighters, because perhaps the Russians will use the combination of those technologies on Turkish soil to spy on, and perhaps they will extract intel from the F-35 fighters, and they'll learn how to best overcome this stealth technology that we're providing. It was just kind of a vague pushback against the Turks, which I think is interesting. So notice the Greeks are allowed to literally take out debt, right? National debt. They're buying F-35 fighters from Lockheed Martin on pure credit, right? Obviously, the Greek state is completely bankrupt. However, the Turks aren't allowed to pay with cash, and allowed to pay with real liquid capital for these American fighters, almost as if America is looking not to empower a bit too much this potentially Muslim majority NATO state. And I mean, who knows? Like, there's all kinds of considerations that perhaps Turkey is this real neutral player in the Middle East. Like, they do have a personal interest which doesn't exactly align with, shall we say, world Talmudic Jewry. Maybe it has its own imperialistic projection of Turkish. Maybe the Turkish Belt Project in and of itself is a project which is not anti-Israeli, but it's certainly against the influence of America and perhaps the West in the region. And hypothetically speaking, to the future, is seeing how friendly Trump was with Putin. It'd be very sad to see President Putin being sort of dragged into this, and Russia being dragged into the Turkish conflict in the Middle East on the pretext that, well, Turkey needs to be subdued, right? This potential aggressive actor. I think there's all kinds of scenarios in the future which can play out. And this Erdogan meeting, actually, just to quote him, he says, and this is, notice his emphasis on defense. So he claims these 47 vehicles worth $500 million and the incredible radar system set up all across Turkey will be labeled not the Iron Dome, the Turks are calling it the Steel Dome. And he says, no country that cannot develop its own radar and air defense system can look to its future with confidence in the face of the current security challenges, especially in our region. Erdogan says, he emphasizes that these systems are a show of strength for Turkey. In air defense, we are ushering in a new era for our beloved Turkey. And so we notice the Turks essentially they're seeing what failures took place in Iran. We're seeing the potential sabotage. The Turks are always ramping up their anti-terroristic forces on the inside. Remember, they have been capturing actually Ukrainian terrorists trying to transport explosives across the territory of Turkey. Yes, the Ukrainians have been trying to, ship over C4 and other explosives like around the entire Black Sea to get to the Kerch Bridge, like we've heard of Georgian special forces and Turkish special forces seizing these explosives over the last 3 years. Of course, the Turks have been fighting against Kurdish terrorism, which we know the Kurds are, in a large extent, really just proxy actors of Israel and the US. So I think the Turks are really feeling the pressure from their hypothetical allies, Conrad, in the region. And it's really unclear as to if there is a crisis within NATO, if NATO is broken up through some act of incongruence, or perhaps there's a disagreement in Europe, especially now that you can clearly see one rising with Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria sort of really standing up against this hyper investment into Ukraine, which is essentially a no-win strategy for all these European nations. And we can clearly see the US bullying these European countries, sort of forcing them to invest into a failed project. And a lot of these countries don't like Ukrainians. They don't want to be involved. They don't want to suffer the economic losses from a loss of Russian gas and oil. I mean, Germany, most likely, if not for Chancellor Merz, who at the moment Merz is really pro-Ukrainian, they don't want to be involved in this particular Eastern European project. And if NATO begins to shatter and break at the seams in Europe, and this alliance finally falls apart because there isn't really a threat of communism, we've all been sort of waiting for NATO to hit the bench finally after 50 years of being active. It's finally very clear to me that Turkey, I think, will be one of the potential future targets. And not saying that Turkey will be a protagonist in the world. I think it'll be very similar to Iran, where a country that is a little bit too powerful, is trying to obtain too much independence, is trying to defend its own sovereignty, its own interests, will be seen as a threat for the future expansion of Greater Israel. And I think even Turkish-Israeli interests at the moment, Turkey 100% most likely is still exporting materials. Despite the export ban from last year, from April and May, when Turkey announced it won't be exporting an entire list, I think 54 different materials to Israel, most likely it has been doing exactly that, exporting these materials to the Haifa ports, sort of unannounced and unscheduled. So we know Turkey has been assisting Israel. We know Azerbaijan, Turkey's ally and proxy, has been assisting Israel recently. But as the situation develops, essentially if we see a breakdown of the Iranian situation as well, we'll see the Middle East, the power really shift in the region, and perhaps the very overpowered Israel, an expanded Israel, will be finally seen by the Turks as something that they cannot simply allow to expand any further. And then maybe we'll see literal clashes on Syrian territory, as we spoke about last year. And it's not very clear at this point, Conrad, whether or not the SNA, the official Syrian army, and the SDF will be getting along. At the moment, they're very much at a standstill. There's an official ceasefire, right? But there's no necessary vision for the future of Syria, how it will look. Will the Kurds have some sort of autonomy in the northeast? Will the Druze receive autonomy in the southwestern region? All of this is really up for grabs. There's a huge power imbalance, I think, in this particular region. And the Turks clearly, with Erdogan's posturing, Hakan Fidan, it's very clear that the Turks see a potential danger for themselves. They don't want to be turned into this new Iran once the Iranian story finally comes to an eventual conclusion and Iran is dealt with by this NATO-esque Israeli alliance with the Gulf states in the Middle East.
No, that's very, very true. And if we think about the prophecies, you mentioned the Kurds, you mentioned what's going on up in the Caucasus. The prophecies say there will be an independent Kurdistan. Armenia will increase greatly. We know about the one-third, one-third, one-third prophecy with the Turks. So thinking about how this goes down, I mean, Israel and Turkey escalate. Israel brings down Turkey's government, installs secular Kemalists. They escalate against Russia. Russia escalates against them, goes down into Syria, goes all the way to Mount Tabor. I mean, if this starts happening, you've got to start being on the lookout for the Antichrist. You know what I mean? Like you've got to, I mean, you'd probably be due to quit your day job.
Mm-hmm.
Spend more time praying, move out to your house in the country, wherever that is, move out near the monastery, whatever your contingency plan is, that when this stuff really starts to go down that direction and, we get one or two more steps down here, you may want to start, taking things into your own hands. But in many ways, these things are probably going to be played out over the next 10, 12, 13, 14 years. And again, as Metropolitan Neophytos recently reiterated from St. Paisios, we will be watching you'll be watching each of these different wars like storms, like when you watch a hurricane for the few days that it's pummeling a part of the coast. It's sort of what each of these fronts are happening before they sort of converge into becoming what will be this one big storm that, culminates in some fairly eschatological things. And I think when you look at the escalation between Israel and Turkey in particular, I think that's one of the most obvious paths forward where you can see the World War Now analysis really start to sort of come together, where everybody else just looking at realpolitik or perhaps just looking at it from the more counter-Semitic, anti-Zionist angle, they're going to miss the fundamental prophetic reality that isn't really going to fall on any human, ideological, moralistic lines. It's going to go down the way that it goes down because God ordains it that for his will. And I do believe that that will ultimately result in an Orthodox Constantinople, which very likely could happen within our lifetime, which would be an incredible thing to see. But in the rest of the region, unfortunately, Israel, they continue to bomb Yemen's capital of Sana'a. From Dave DeCamp here, Israeli military bombed the Yemeni capital of Sana'a for the second time within a week on Thursday, as the Houthis, officially known as al-Sharaa, have continued their attacks on Israel in response to their genocidal war in the Gaza Strip. Israeli officials claimed to Israeli media outlets that the strike targeted a group of 10 senior officials who were gathered to hear a speech by Ansar Allah leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi, but Houthi officials denied the claim. What is happening is the target of civilian objects and the entire Yemeni people due to their supportive stance towards Gaza, said Houthi official Nasser al-Din Amer. A Yemeni military source described Israel's claims and comments to al-Mayadeen as psychological and propaganda warfare that is ineffective and will have no impact on the course of operations. So far, there have been no reports of casualties in the strikes. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz referenced the plague of the firstborn, referencing the biblical narrative from the book of Exodus about the plague brought upon Egypt that resulted in the deaths of all firstborn males. As we warned the Houthis in Yemen, after the plague of darkness comes the plague of the firstborn, Katz said, according to the Times of Israel. So, Israeli officials are casually invoking the Old Testament to call for, the genocide of children of their enemies who are only their enemies because they are standing against them for committing a different genocide. So that's the level of, we're sort of getting to exponential levels of genocide here, where genocide squared, cubed, I don't know what level the Israelis are getting at now, but it's getting insanely ridiculous. And before I move on to Iran here, I want to encourage everybody to watch my live stream this week. Encourage, of course, like this episode, worldwarnow.co. If you're watching on Substack or YouTube, please like the episode. We're trying to get these over 50 likes per episode, so it really helps us out. But be sure to check out my live stream, my episode of World War Live, which, of course, every Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m. Central Time, I am live on YouTube, Substack, and the World War Now X account, discussing all things World War III, World War Now, and I discussed the bombing of the Nasser Hospital in Gaza in Khan Yunis, where on video we saw the death and the murder of those 5 journalists that were killed by the Israeli double tap strike. If you want to see my full breakdown, reaction, and analysis to that, check out my stream this week. I break that down. It's crazy that it's sort of why I have to start doing that stream, because if I didn't do that, so much other things in the Gaza genocide and the West Bank genocide and Israel's, greater expansion project went down this week that we would have forgotten about, the targeting of these journalists and the massive strike on that hospital that killed, it's killed like 20 plus people at this point just in that single strike. Again, more journalists per capita have died in this Gaza war than any other conflict by far. So you take the civilian casualties, these journalistic casualties, it's clear this is a genocide. It's not a war. And to call it a war is to put some credit on these genocide soldiers in Gaza's names that they don't deserve. These aren't veterans. These aren't soldiers. These aren't warriors. These are janissaries of an ethnic cleansing being deployed by the forces of Satan. That's effectively what's going on right now. But unless you have any other thoughts on that, Dimitri, we do need to discuss the new snapback sanctions against Iran. This is also from Dave DeCamp. The UK, France, and Germany have begun the process of reimposing UN Security Council sanctions on Iran under the snapback mechanism of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, a step that takes another US-Israeli war on Iran more likely. The European countries known as the E3 sent a letter to the UN Security Council notifying it that they are triggering the sanctions, which will take effect in 30 days. Iran has said that the E3 countries don't have the right to reimpose the sanctions since it was the US that withdrew from and violated the JCPOA in 2018. The E3 said they were open to reaching a diplomatic deal with Iran that could halt the sanctions, but it's unclear what sort of agreement could be reached. Their demands include that Iran resume full cooperation with the IAEA, but Tehran's recent decision to allow IAEA inspectors to return to Iran didn't stop the E3 from triggering sanctions. So Iran is openly revamping for a potentially renewed war with Israel. Israel is openly saying that war with Iran could erupt at any time. They're accusing Iran of continuing to hide from these newly invited IAE inspectors their rapid rebuilding projects that they did at the U.S., the sites that the U.S. and Israel bombed, trying to hide construction that they did. They have all sorts of accusations about the location and the amount of the enriched uranium. And then there, of course, come the news leaks about Russia supposedly giving Israel a lot of Iran's codes and the locations of their air defense systems and all sorts of other critical military info and intelligence, which Russia is now vehemently denying, saying it's disinfo seeking to disrupt the relationship between Iran and Russia. So I would love to hear your thoughts on these developments, Dimitri.
Yeah, that's very interesting because that sort of fake news story, or hypothetically in Russia, it's called fake news, clearly misinformation. It actually came out of al-Arabiya, which is essentially, if you think about it, Al Jazeera is the Qatari, Doha-based, very Muslim Brotherhood-heavy news media source, right? The news company, and you have al-Arabiya, which comes from Riyadh, Saudi-based news source. And yes, it did claim that Russia was essentially trading these Iranian air defense secrets to Israel before the 12-day war. And this is, of course, a huge sort of breaking story, which Russia clearly denied very instantly. And what's interesting is, I don't even think Iran truly believed this story either, because recently, and this actually took place in Iran, the ambassador to Moscow, Qasem Jalali, actually said very warm things about the Russo-Iranian relationship. On the 25th of August, he said, soon we hope the Russian-Iranian relationship will only strengthen. He says, we are currently negotiating with Gazprom, he says, about a gas project, building a new gas pipeline from Russia to Iran via Azerbaijan, he actually said. And this will begin as early as 2025, perhaps towards the end of the year, and it will transport gas at a volume of up to 1.8 billion cubic meters per year. So, quite a significant gas pipeline apparently from Iran via Azerbaijan under the Caspian Sea or just along the coast towards Russia. Very interesting project. And this is, of course, the Iranian ambassador to Moscow, to Russia, Qasem Jalali. So he was very, very proud of the Russo-Iranian relationship moving forward, and also very hopeful. He also undermined the theories that the Azeris were in fact allowing Israeli reconnaissance to actually breach Iranian border space and using Azeri territory for scouting targets on Iranian territory during the 12-day war. So very interesting, this sort of positioning, Conrad. He's somewhat agreeing. It looks like the Iranian officials, they're trying to de-escalate tensions of Azerbaijan. They're trying to take on the Aliyev position. Remember, Aliyev claimed very, I suppose, earnestly from his perspective that Azerbaijan provided no assistance to either the US or Israel during the 12-day war. I think all countries are trying to de-escalate very clearly. And an example of this is not just Jalali's statement, but President Putin actually on the 22nd of August, so just earlier this week, at the beginning of the week, he congratulated Ilham Aliyev's wife on her birthday, actually. And she's the vice president of Azerbaijan. And yes, you may say nepotism, right? The wife of the president of Azerbaijan is also the first vice president. So she is obviously like second in charge. It's like if Melania Trump was the vice president of the US, everyone would be raise some eyebrows about that. But hey, that's just the positioning. But President Putin sent her a private message, sort of congratulating her. So that's very interesting. Clearly, President Putin wants to keep that potential trade, Caspian Sea, warm relationship alive between Azerbaijan and Russia. I think one of the reasons for this as well, Conrad, is because Russia has been selling gas and oil through Azeri companies to the rest of Europe, as well as Turkey through Sokar. So we know Sokar is just the general Azeri oil and gas company, which transports energy further westwards. However, Sokar doesn't just utilize Azeri oil and gas sources. So Russia is not using a shadow fleet, so to speak, in the Caspian, but it is transporting oil and gas. And then, of course, they're being stamped with Azeri stickers and being transported elsewhere. And apparently, this is a hypothetical relationship. A lot of Russian geopolitical analysts have been saying, why has Putin's administration not put even more pressure on Azerbaijan? It's probably because they've had that anti-sanction relationship. And this is maybe one of the trump cards that Azerbaijan has against Russia, is that they know that Russia is trying to trade goods with the rest of Europe through sort of a mutual partnership with the southern neighbor. And that's very interesting. But there's big things coming up, in relationship to the southern Caucasus, and potentially this could rectify a lot of the huge tensions that have been building this year, which have led many of us to believe that there would literally be a special military operation in the southern Caucasus, the Caspian Sea. And obviously none of us wanted to escalate that badly. Nobody wants Azerbaijan, for example, to join NATO, to become a NATO partner for the Turkish Belt development. But both Aliyev and Pashinyan will actually be present in Beijing for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit for the Chinese National Day on the 1st of October this year. So in late September, actually, Pashinyan said very clearly that he's also, just before traveling to China, he's going to travel to Russia. Pashinyan officially announced this. And he says that he's very happy to meet with Putin. I'm pleased that Russia is anticipating my visit, says Pashinyan. And I always look forward to the invitations from this country. As I noted earlier, I plan to meet with the president of Russia in Beijing also. So Pashinyan's very hopeful. Look at him, so friendly. His wife visits Zelensky and he visits Putin personally. It's just literally a two-faced character of sorts. And it'll be very interesting to see what kind of agreements he'll come to with Putin. And this comes actually at an interesting time as well, because the mayor of Gyumri, we mentioned this particular city, well, I suppose it's like a small town in Armenia. Yeah, and this comes at an interesting time when the mayor of the city of Gyumri, it's actually the second largest city in Armenia, the mayor of Gyumri mentioned how important the joint Russo-Armenian relationship is. Notice he's countering all of those anti-Russian former Pashinyan government statements. And to quote him, he says very clearly, Russians are protecting our border. Russians with their flag are safeguarding the sovereignty of Armenia. Those who want the Russian base to leave Armenia, they want Armenia to become a Turkish vilayet for the Turks to enter Armenia. These lying Europeans and those who feed on their grants, they are selling the Republic of Armenia and the homeland for money. There is no great figure of the Armenian nation who would not say that the salvation of the Armenians lies in union with Russia. And today, with the Russian flag in Armenia and in Gyumri, we feel safe. If the Russian base leaves, then the Turkish base will come here. And mind you, this is quite a big Russian base, 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers, including air defense systems, tanks, troop transportation vessels, and even the nearby Armenian bases. They have Russian helicopters and Russian warplanes, Mikoyan planes stationed there as well. So quite a significant, it's the last real outpost of Russia south of the Caucasus Mountains. And that's the mayor of the city speaking. So I'm not sure if he's necessarily like ideologically opposed to Pashinyan or whatever, but this particular position of his, I mean, he knows history, right, Conrad? He knows Russia has saved Armenian people from genocide multiple times before the First World War, and from many different enemies, including for the Shia Persians and the Sunni and the Sunni Turks. And it's very clear that Armenia's future, if it wishes to retain any sort of even symbolic independence or sovereignty, yes, the only ally it really can have is, of course, north, just over the Caucasus, the same country which secured the existence of Georgia and allowed Georgian population to increase by, I mean, historically, from the time of the Napoleonic Wars until the Russian Revolution, the Georgian population quadrupled, if not increased 5 times over. And you can't say that's because of industrialization. No, that's because of the peace that the Russian Empire guaranteed for the Georgian people and their various other minority ethnicities living there. So quite a benefit, I think, for various Christian denominations and local people. So it's really, really interesting, Conrad. We're going to see a big meeting between Aliyev, Pashinyan and Putin potentially in Beijing, in Shanghai, later towards the end of September. It'll be a good time for all these sort of world leaders of the Southern Caucasus to come to terms, perhaps discuss and de-escalate tensions. But, what throws a wrench into all of this is, notice we spoke about this early 20s August discussions and friendly talks and birthday congratulations. But on the 27th of August, just a day and a half ago, Aliyev, of course, had to throw a wrench into all of this, where he openly claimed that in the early 1920s, Azerbaijan became a colony of Russia. He says that Russians colonized Azerbaijan at the beginning of the 20th century, and since then we've obtained our independence. He also blamed Russia for shooting down that plane in November of last year, and he says that we still haven't received any explanation. And it's a very serious situation, Aliyev said. It has damaged our bilateral relationship. And he also said that, remember the 2 Yekaterinburg criminals who the Russian police detained and then they died, surprisingly, in Russian police custody in Yekaterinburg, which is clearly, I mean, if the police did beat these 2 people up, and these are people of Azeri ethnicity, but they're Russian citizens, I mean, this is just the police power overreach of some sort. This is an internal Russian corruption investigation. It has nothing to do with sort of Azerbaijani geopolitical interests. But Aliyev still said, these are unfounded attacks on Azerbaijanis in Russia. 2 people were tortured and killed, and the official information that came out later said that they died of a heart attack in custody. Even if they committed a crime such as murder 20 years ago, they are still our people. They cannot be treated like that, Aliyev said. So Aliyev clearly still positioning himself as this like strong holder of Azeri interests. And I think this comes at a really interesting time. And clearly there's a bit of a schizophrenic, somewhat bilateral division inside of Russia, Conrad. I think Russians, they realize that they're so intertwined with Azerbaijanis, both the Azeri Mountain Jew oligarchs inside of Russia owning so many domestic industries, including the real estate industry, the massive supermarket centers, bazaars, marketplaces, as well as the shopping centers inside of Russia. Every single Russian major city has some sort of Azeri businessman running a huge percentage of the domestic trade. I mean, this is not something you can clearly deal with. The Russian TV show industry is run by Azeris. And all of this, I think, builds to the stalemate within the Russian decision-making center, wherein if Russia was really to break relations with Azerbaijan once and for all, they would have to do that on some serious grounds. Like the Azeris would have to either kill Russian nationals or perhaps make another incursion into Armenia or offend Russia in some very serious way. It appears, Conrad, that despite all of our warnings to Russia to be very wary of Azerbaijan, is clearly a two-faced actor, one that allies both with Turkey and with Israel, one that pretends to be Shia Muslim whilst allying clearly with enemies of Shia Islam. Clearly, this is an actor which is doing things that contradict its internal ethic and moral principles, not somebody that Russia can really sustain a relationship with in the long term, somebody that potentially will backstab Russia. And the construction of this hypothetical Turkish belt, this push for a potential new gas line between Turkmenistan and Europe through the southern Caspian, ignoring Iran, ignoring Russia, all these threats are not being addressed by the Russian leadership. And I think eventually, even if this Beijing-Shanghai meeting of Vladimir Putin, Pashinyan, and Aliyev, if it comes out agreeable and everyone is happy with the results, I think eventually these threats will play out into something very real on the southern border of Russia. I think these geopolitical tensions, which we spoke about, will lead to an eventual breaching of peace. Russian interests, of course, are not the only thing we speak about on the show, but clearly I think eventually this will impact the interests of all these other Christian minorities, such as the Georgians, such as the Armenians. We know no one's even addressing the fact that the Azeris have genocided and committed literally cultural genocide in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is still when you speak to Armenians, they take this very seriously. 150,000, up to 150,000 Armenians were ethnically, culturally displaced. The numbers don't meet the standards we see currently in Palestine, Gaza, which is hundreds and thousands, potentially, as the UN says, 1 million Palestinians will be displaced. But still, huge numbers of Christians were moved about. Their homes have been destroyed. Their local statues, their shrines, churches of the Apostolic Armenian Church were destroyed. And the Russian reaction was less than adequate. So I think all these Christian minorities, they're very much dependent on Russia finally waking up and realizing the potential threat to the Southern Caucasus. And at the moment, Conrad, it looks like the political nullification of all these threats, it's very real. I think Russia really is just trying to focus, hyperfixate on the Eastern Ukrainian issue and not to create more enemies in the South. I think this is the main position of Putin and his administration. They're trying not to expand the world war. And maybe it's somewhat admirable. They're trying to keep the peace for as long as possible before things really break down.
No, I hear exactly what you're saying. And with Azerbaijan, I think they're one of these countries that, as far as what we're talking about with the potential for World War III, they're an extremely, much like Russia, as you talked about before, Russian interests, the moment Russian interests, it becomes so obvious that Turkey is working against Russian interests that is going to be a major catalyst for what St. Paisios has predicted geopolitically. I view Azerbaijan as sort of, from our perspective, probably the most relevant, I call it like a thermometer country, because based on what Azerbaijan is doing, we can kind of predict the blocks with which this is going to break down. And of course, everyone's heard me explain how I've been afraid of the possibility where Turkey, Iran, and these countries sort of are aligned against Israel, and Israel has Azerbaijan and Russia and Greece and the EU on their side. And that's sort of why Turkey ends up getting destroyed and Iran would go along with them. But based on what appears to be Azerbaijan's fierce mission to completely alienate itself from Russia and go against Russia, it's becoming clear to me that, as I described in the earlier segment of the show, it's more likely that Israel will help facilitate regime change in Turkey, and then Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Israel will be on the same side against Russia and Iran. And of course, in many ways, what went down in Nagorno-Karabakh was just a sort of a prequel, sort of a little appetizer to the Gaza genocide, right? It was a Israeli ally, this sort of secular, genocidal, pseudo-Jewish country of Azerbaijan was allowed to ethnically cleanse a historical enemy of Israel and the Jewish people, Armenians. The Armenian Apostolic Church, them and the Orthodox Church in the Holy Land in Jerusalem are grave enemies of Israel. Israel recently bulldozed the Armenian seminary and most of the Armenian quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. So it's no wonder that they would support, which they did, the Israelis directly supported Azerbaijan's genocide. They provided them with weapons, intelligence. And of course, here we are, Armenia is siding with them against Russia. And think about how much more relevant it would have been if Russia had, instead of playing realpolitik and been like, oh, both these countries were parts of the Soviet Union, Israel's also our ally. So if we do the realpolitik math here, we should side with Armenia, we should side with Azerbaijan and Israel. That's the Nietzschean position. That's the Baptist position. Might makes right. We should side with these people. Well, look how that played out for you. Both of them ended up betraying you. Armenia obviously betrayed you because you betrayed them. And then Israel and Azerbaijan betrayed you because they're your civilizational enemies that are going to ultimately wage a war of extinction against you because you're a Christian country. That's how this is going to go. And just, again, from Russia's perspective, they need to just read the public statements from Aliyev. And Aliyev this week, he called the country's entry into the Soviet Union an invasion and an occupation. And again, Aliyev is getting invited to the Chinese victory parade with Putin. When his country was in the Soviet Union, they contributed to victories against, Nazism and these sorts of things. The question becomes, what side is Aliyev really on? Not that we're here pro-Soviet Union, but it's not like Aliyev is a Russian monarchist. He accused Soviet authorities of allegedly taking Western Zangezur from Azerbaijan and transferring it to Armenia, resulting in the division of Azerbaijani territory into two parts. Aliyev stated that he does not consider Baku responsible for the deterioration of relations with Moscow. According to him, Azerbaijan acts constructively and legally, but does not intend to tolerate aggression or disrespect. And in that same week, this is a report from August 24th, Azerbaijan and Armenia have reportedly agreed to cooperate among themselves and together with the CIA in order to combat Russian intelligence operations in the region. So we've got the US, Armenia, and Azerbaijan kicking the Russians out towards the north, and you're going to have Azerbaijan, Armenia, the US, and Turkey kicking Iranian influence out from the south. Iran claims they're going to confront the Zangezur corridor that Turkey is already mechanizing and infrastructure, beefing up the infrastructure there. We'll see how that goes. But regardless, I think both of us have come to the conclusion, and we're on the pulse, Dimitri. This is probably the main vector, the main choke point that isn't necessarily currently a hot conflict, but it's the main region and diplomatic situation that I think is going to escalate into the World War III we've been talking about. And if more people were paying attention to it, perhaps they would agree with our conclusions. But we do need to move on to the situation in Ukraine. And one of the biggest announcements, of course, was that Trump will be arming Ukraine with $825 million worth of extended range attack munition, air-launched missiles, which can hit targets up to 280 miles away. This would be the most long-range missile that Ukraine has been supplied with from the West. The U.S. historically supplied them with ATACMS, which are in the sort of similar range as Storm Shadow and Neptune missiles, which come from the U.K. and France, respectively. And those hit anywhere from 120, 130 up to 190 miles away. And that's how Ukraine has been hitting into Russia, how they've been hitting Crimea, a lot of these other places. But now 280 miles away, that's going to allow them to hit much, much deeper into Russia. This is going to be a major escalation. And obviously, it would make sense based on Trump's recent comments. He said, I'm not happy, but not surprised by Russian missile strikes on Ukraine and on Kiev. Putin's been striking the capital, despite the U.S. claiming that they said they weren't going to do those sorts of things. So in general, whatever goodwill was established at that silly Alaska summit has been completely wiped away. German Chancellor Merz has openly said there will obviously be no Putin-Zelensky meeting. So we have taken a dozen steps back, however many steps forward we may have taken with that Alaska nonsense. So here we are, probably closer to a conflict between NATO and Russia than we had been in well over a year. Definitely much escalated since Trump took office against his idea that he was going to end the conflict before he was even inaugurated. So that's the situation there. It's very much like we've predicted, but the front line, of course, is moving very much in Russia's favor, if you would like to discuss that, Dimitri.
Oh, yes. Russia, of course, is making huge gains. Just this week, they've moved 10 kilometers closer to our beloved eastern Svyatogorsk Lavra, actually located just to the north, about 15 kilometers away from Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Well, Slavyansk to be exact. And specifically, so the Russians now are 14, 15 kilometers away from the Svyatogorsk Lavra. Very interesting because the actual leader of that Lavra is currently, of course, in Ukrainian prison, sitting there with his particular sentence. He's been charged with assisting the Russian forces for spying on the Ukrainians, and of course announcing that the Ukrainians have been imposing certain roadblocks and putting up outposts near his Svetogorsk Lavra, which apparently, if you mention that in your sermons, therefore you are spying on Russia and providing military information to the enemy, and which is clearly like just general information. Of course, the Ukrainians would have out checkpoints on their own highways and roads next to a key object such as a huge monastery. Like, it's very obvious. But Metropolitan Arsenis is currently sitting in the Dnipropetrovsk prison, of course, in New Heavenly Jerusalem, New Khazaria capital. And as he's doing that, the Russians are making incredible progress very fast and quickly moving towards that North Slavyansk Svetogorsk zone, which is really important. We really can't wait enough for the Svetogorsk Lavra to be liberated finally. I think it'll be a very special episode when we discuss that. It'll be very interesting to see how the Russians really clear that area of Ukrainians. I doubt very much that we will see Russian artillery hitting the Svetogorsk Lavra churches and monastery buildings. If anything, I think we'll hopefully, God forbid, but the Russians will most likely move around that, of course, clear out any Ukrainian defensive positions, and then maybe begin preparing for that long-awaited Slavyansk siege, which I think they didn't, of course, commence in 2022, but we all spoke about many times on different episodes, including the 8th hour episodes discussing the first Donbass heroes early on in our show about the siege of Slavyansk and the importance of that city. This is the real first city of rebellion against the Maidan regime set up in Ukraine in early 2014, which, of course, the pro-Russian Orthodox Christian forces were trying to hold back and trying to defend against the Ukrainian onslaught. So very key symbolic city there. But besides that offensive, the Russians are currently trying to encircle the northern city of Kupiansk as well. Very key city, defensively positioned in the north. The Russians are approaching Kupiansk specifically from the northern side and the northwestern side. Kupiansk, most likely, the Ukrainians at least are predicting from what I've seen on their media that as soon as the Russians begin entering into Kupiansk, or there is a threat that the entire city will be surrounded, they're going to leave. Kupiansk apparently is not as heavily reinforced or defended as cities such as Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. And so the Ukrainians at least are hoping that then they're going to be sacrificing tens of thousands of soldiers there, like in Avdiivka or Bakhmut, defending land, which, I mean, majority of the population of Kupiansk is probably pro-Russian anyway. So it's really unclear why the Ukrainians should be laying down their souls for something which really, for a land that's not theirs, even by ideology. And moving further south, of course, Konstantinovka, we mentioned last week how the Russians were long-range bombing Konstantinovka FABs. That has continued. So the Russians are dropping FABs on very key strategic villages and locations along the southern end of Konstantinovka. Specifically, what they do is the Ukrainians are using, and these villages are mostly empty. So they're scouting out particular villages which are used as Ukrainian drone launch positions. And you may be asking, like, how are Ukrainians doing that? Well, so Ukrainians send groups between 50 and 100 forces into these villages, and then they use the residential homes, the dachi, the farmhouses, even the greenhouses as these storerooms where they prepare the drones, they arm them with explosives, and they send them out from these villages. So they look like, obviously, urban settlements, but they're basically reinforced small military outposts. And the Russians are dropping FABs directly on these villages. I mean, very sad, because hopefully there's no farm animals or innocent Russians or Ukrainians like stationed there, but most likely these are completely desolate zones occupied by Ukrainian forces, and the Russians are clearing them out completely. They're not interested in taking these villages one by one through long sort of sieges or risking their frontline stormtrooper infantry. The Russians are just dropping big bombs on these villages. So Konstantinovka is the next big point of the siege, which the Russians will conduct. It looks like, in fact, Conrad, that the Russians will be sieging in the next month or so, probably before October. We'll be seeing a triple siege for the first time. We'll see the northern Kupiansk besieged and surrounded. We'll see Konstantinovka more south of that. And of course, to the southwest of Konstantinovka, we're going to see Pokrovsk for the first time, most likely taken by the Russians. And Pokrovsk, heavy fighting, very heavy. We see mortar rounds, bombs being thrown around. The reports from the Ukrainian side, of course, the Russian side is not giving any information about how many forces they have stationed, but the Ukrainian media sources are telling us that there are between 100,000 and 200,000 Russian troops around Pokrovsk and trying to enter into the city, or at least positioning in a strategic formation towards the northeast as well. So northeast of Pokrovsk, we have those two mining cities, Mirnograd, and you have Radinskaya, which the Radinskaya Russians have more or less taken, but Mirnograd is very interesting because the Ukrainians have been defending it fairly ferociously. In fact, he had the two towns of Novonikolaevka and Novoekonomichna, and the Ukrainians used a few thousand troops to try and take these two villages, to try and surround the Russian forces at Mirnograd, and successfully so they took the two villages in less than a day, only to be pushed back by the Russians, and resulting in, I think, hundreds of Ukrainian casualties. So the Ukrainians are not sitting there passively just allowing the Russians to push them. No, they're actually trying to prevent the full surround of Pokrovsk by whatever means necessary. And unfortunately, it's just not working out for them. And I think Syrskyi is really still being painted as the butcher of Ukrainians in this east or western Donbass zone. So it's not looking very good for them. And as soon as Pokrovsk falls, as we said, it'll be a huge PR victory. It'll be the new Mariupol, Avdiivka, Bakhmut situation. The Ukrainian morale will fall, and the Russians will be very easily pivoting most of their forces northwards to take Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. We're going to see, most likely, by the end of the year, Conrad, a complete liberation of those 6,000 kilometers squared remaining Donetsk territories that the Ukrainians are holding to this day, so the one particular goal of the SMO will finally be completed. Donetsk and Lugansk will be liberated. And yes, it may have taken longer than the duration of the entire First World War. So just keep in mind, by about October of this year, this will officially be longer than World War I for Russia, which in its overall duration lasted for about 3 years and 7 months, I think, to the date, actually. So it'll be very interesting to see exactly how all of this ends by the end of the year, by Christmas time, my guess is. So the Russians are making clear progress. And the interesting development, actually, from the Russians, and this is completely unexpected news, and of course, this comes as a heavy demoralization move from the Russians. They used, for the first time in their history of the Russian Navy, a underwater submarine drone against the biggest Ukrainian ship, the reconnaissance ship Simferopol. You'll be asking, wait, isn't Simferopol a city in Crimea? Like, why do Ukrainians have a ship named like that? Well, it just shows you that continuity that the Ukrainian Black Sea Navy, whatever's left of it, has with the old Russian and even Soviet Navy of the Black Sea. And so where was this reconnaissance ship located, and how big was it? Well, it roughly had a crew of 29, maybe 35 people, but it wasn't in the Black Sea, Conrad. It was hiding in the Danube Delta in the Odessa Oblast. So that long river traveling all through Europe, traveling from most of those Balkan countries, the Danube, its delta is located in Romania, Bulgaria, and that Odessa, Moldova zone. And the Ukrainian reconnaissance ship, was hiding in the delta, and the Russians, bypassing all of the civilian ships, I guess they located the Simferopol and blew it up. Just one shot, the drone smashed. It was essentially a suicide submarine drone, smashed into the Simferopol, and it has officially sunk. So the Ukrainians, even if you check the Wikipedia page of the Simferopol, they have officially announced on 28th of August, the ship has been officially destroyed. 2 crew members have died, but many more are injured. So the Ukrainians have officially lost their largest ship of the Black Sea Navy fleet. And this is a huge victory for Russia, big demoralization strike against Ukraine. The Russians are showing that, look, they're actually developing new technologies to battle, potentially even, look, you know who's paying attention, right? As I said, the Turks, who are building a new aircraft carrier. They're doubling their fleet size. Probably by the end of 2026, the Turkish fleet will be twice the size as it was at the beginning of the special military operation. So Russians developing these anti-fleet technologies, I think, is incredibly key. And we're seeing, of course, a huge boost to the Russian morale. On the front lines, of course, Russians not announcing any new waves of mobilization. The Russians are quite content with the new forces they have. There's almost no movements in the Sumskaya Oblast or up north near Volchansk, Kharkov. The Russians are very fixated on taking those last few bits of territories in the Donetsk Oblast. And all the while, the Ukrainians, I've noticed there's a particular trend. Zelensky clearly is very interested in increasing his reputation domestically among fellow Ukrainians. So the sort of key reform that he recently passed was he allowed 18 to 22-year-olds, if I'm not mistaken, young Ukrainian men who are currently not conscripted in the military, but they're still sort of listed for potential recruitment in the future. He allowed them to leave Ukraine for the first time. This is the first time young men over the age of 18 have been allowed to leave Ukraine since the beginning of the special military operation. Keep in mind, there are about between 600,000 and 700,000 young Ukrainian men and women who are currently still learning in higher education facilities. So they're going to college in Ukraine, universities. And if you're assigned as a student, if you're currently studying in Ukraine, you cannot be actually kidnapped off the streets. You can't be forced to join the Tetsaka, recruitment sent to the trenches to die. So a lot of these young Ukrainians have in fact been studying very hard. They've been getting into universities and colleges in order to avoid military recruitment. And we really can't blame them. I don't think it's a matter of courage or cowardice. I think it's just an act of self-preservation. They're fighting a war which really has no meaning for them. They're fighting for a country which is less than 30 years of age, for a regime which really came into power illegally in 2013 and essentially is under international occupation at this point by NATO forces. And it's very interesting to see all the young people actually positioning at checkpoints out of Ukraine in the western regions, and even from the Odessa Oblast into Moldova, you see there's huge lines of cars, and they're all being checked. Of course, the Ukrainians are checking, making sure there's no people over the age of 22 or 23 leaving the country illegally. So all these young men are literally in their cars getting out of the country. It's not just young Ukrainian women. I think we're going to see an outflow of tens of thousands of young people who just want to avoid the next big wave of forced mobilization or some sort of new Ukrainian law that will be passed. And again, why did Ukrainian government, why did they force this particular change? Like, wouldn't Zelensky benefit from recruiting more people? I think, Conrad, those George Soros-esque, those American protests that took place with Nabu in Kiev and these other cities like Lvov, I think they kind of forced this hand. And you correctly put off air that maybe this is a release valve for people who are actually opposed to Zelensky's regime, either hyper-nationalistic Ukrainians who disagree with Zelensky's behavior during the war, or maybe very liberal Ukrainians, for them to leave the country freely and to not form some sort of oppositional basis inside of Ukraine. So tens of thousands of Ukrainians leaving the country. I think, generally speaking, this is probably a good thing, even for Russia. Less civilians means less potential civilian collateral targets, less of a recruitment base for the Ukrainian military, which has been completely disregarding human life during this conflict. We spoke last week about the hypothetical number of losses in Ukraine, over 1,700,000 people lost. And, just to add to all of this, just recently they've announced that there's going to be a new graveyard constructed in Ukraine, actually, graveyard out west that will be able to hold over 140,000 new bodies. And already 4 unnamed soldiers of Ukrainian origin were buried there. Keep in mind, the Ukrainians have not been paying out for lost soldiers to families, and the payments are quite large. Actually, if you look at the payment size, it's actually impossible for the Ukrainian government to be paying out to the relatives, that is the wives and the parents of the deceased soldiers, $350,000 American dollars, right, in compensation for each Ukrainian man who's died. And we know 100% this is why they bury these soldiers in unnamed graves, and they don't actually announce that they've passed away. They say, oh, they're missing in action. And I know this personally from some of my friends who they have either relatives or people they know several degrees removed in Ukraine who have gone missing, and from at the beginning of the conflict in 2022, and still they're listed as missing in action. And they've probably died somewhere, or they were forcibly recruited and they've perished, and the Ukrainian government still lists them as missing in action because they wish to, of course, not repay compensation to their families. So the Ukrainians, the state is building more graveyards. It's allowing for some young people to leave. But generally speaking, we see the regime really, it's walking a fine line between complete collapse and obviously, I have to agree with Alexei Arestovich here, this particular Ukrainian oppositionary leader. He clearly stated that even if Ukraine is successful in obtaining a ceasefire or a peace deal, it has completely lost all of its sovereignty and independence. It is entirely indebted to the West, to NATO. Even if Ukraine has these nationalistic battalions who have retained authority and have built up their forces and reputation, and Andrei Belitsky, this radical Azov battalion guy, is still around giving these speeches, and he's a real figure of authority, it's not going to save Ukraine from ever obtaining even a semblance of the independence that it had before the Maidan took place. Ukraine forever has become a proxy vassal state of international actors. And at this point, I think that's sort of the fate which awaits it. And it's not surprising. You can't really blame all the young Ukrainians for, losing hope and leaving their nation. I wouldn't call it cowardice at all.
No, I very much agree. And you hinted at some of this, but, Zelensky is very much aware that if things start to go a certain direction, he has to face, potential mutinies and coups from both the radical Azovites, these Banderite, hardcore Ukrainian nationalists that would want to fight to the last Ukrainian against Russia, as well as these people that are sort of ambivalent, and maybe they want peace, and maybe they just want, they also potentially want Western integration. So if these goals aren't achieved, Zelensky is aware that he might have to face, say, some kind of public crisis, and potentially allowing some of these young men that would, form the ranks of these resistance groups and these people that could work against him, allowing some of them to leave, he feels could be a bit of a pressure release valve. So I think this is an important, you got to think about this in a lot of different ways, but it is good. I think that some Orthodox Christian people will survive. And again, I'm not going to get into some discussion of fleeing your country and not fighting and this, that, or the other. I don't really believe Ukraine is a real country. So that sort of puts to rest any debates we would have about what that really means. But speaking of, the front line itself and casualties and recruits, North Korea's Red Star TV, which is of course a party apparatus, outlet in North Korea, on August 22nd, they published a 19-minute long documentary showing the participation of North Koreans, Korean People's Army, fighting alongside the Russians in the Kursk campaign against Ukrainian armed forces. The video is 19 minutes long. You can find it on the World War Now Telegram. It's from Bellum Acta. The timeline of the video basically takes you through the KPA's arrival in Russia and their preparation, their fighting and the use of North Korean MLRS Type 75 and 60 millimeter mortars, the use of KPA grenade launchers against the equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine, KPA soldiers doing first aid on the wounded and assault actions, video of a KPA headquarters discussion in the field, the use of FPV drones by Korean soldiers, and the use of other warfare tactics by Korean soldiers. And the claim in the video is that 104 Korean People's Army soldiers were killed in action fighting against Ukrainian armed forces and allies in the Kursk Oblast. So very real level of confirmation from Ukrainian, state TV itself. I don't know if that number is accurate. It sounds weirdly accurate. I don't know why they would, if they're going to cite a number, I don't know why they would say, 104 of us were killed in action. I'm assuming not many of them were really taken prisoner. I don't know if they were, committing seppuku or whatnot, whatever they do and whatever Koreans do when they are about to be taken captive by the enemy. That might make sense because, who knows what directives they were given. But this is some very interesting information. The footage and the video itself is all in Korean, so I couldn't understand it. Maybe someone can subtitle it at some point, but some very fascinating footage for sure. And you can see North Korean soldiers celebrating with North Korean flags and, killing Ukrainians and whatnot. So it's a very kind of surreal to watch, frankly, but very fascinating to see and confirming some stuff that, we've been talking about on the show for a while. But another story here, and this is actually posted by Russians with Attitude. They've been posting more and more good stuff recently. They posted a story about some Ukrainian drones that have been crashing near the Russo-Estonian border with unknown origin, effectively confirming that there are reconnaissance drones and, loitering munition drones, actual attack drones coming out of Estonia, which we've been talking about on the show for, I think, well over a year and a half, maybe even 2 years now, that this likely is happening, especially some of these swarms on St. Petersburg that have occurred. These are all either coming from cells within Russia, but likely, I think, from certain cells within Russia, as well as certain cells on the Russo-Estonian border, where directly across the border in some of these forested areas, they're able to operate, under the full protection of the NATO umbrella, but, effectively seem as if they're operating from within Russia without, at least yet, implicating Estonia, and of course its NATO Article 5 capabilities, into the conflict yet. That has not happened. And of course, I've always maintained that at this point, with the exception of maybe Kazakhstan, short of then, obviously we have what's going on in Ukraine, we have sort of some rapprochement with Georgia, and then we of course have the future integration with Belarus. The main thing outside of that would be Russia. I think they do have some strategic interests in Estonia and Latvia in particular that I would wager might require a special military operation. And based on how they've talked about it, I think they might be leaving that door open. As far as other Russian news, the Slovakians have resumed tourist visa issuance for Russians. So now Russians can take tourist visas to Slovakia. So that's sort of one sign towards the normalization with certain Western countries with the Russians. So that's somewhat of a good sign. But if things keep going as they're going, I should be in Russia as well as Moldova in the next few weeks. So keep me in your prayers regarding that. And I will be keeping everybody posted on that trip. It should be a great trip, should meet some great people in the church. So very excited. But before we move on to the United States and this tranny shooting at the Catholic Church and all this other stuff, Dimitri, what do you have any final thoughts on Russia, Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting period, sort of the late end of summer here, going into autumn. In Eastern Europe, of course, it's a perfect time for military operations to take place. And, the predictions of Igor Strelkov for this week, they've been somewhat pessimistic. He's openly stated that the Russians are somewhat exhausting their offensive capabilities. We can clearly see that Russia, based on its current recruitment of soldiers, is only capable of making certain pushes on one end of the battlefield. Clearly, as soon as notice the Kursk operation ended, that's when Russia began progressing through Donetsk. So last year in August, remember the Russians were besieging Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, for example, before they even began this new operation in Pokrovsk. And you can clearly see that as soon as the invasion of Kursk commenced by Ukraine, all of these progressions in the Donbass ceased, and the Russians moved a huge portion of their troops, probably as many as between 50 and 100,000, as well as a lot of equipment up north to sort of guarantee security of their zones and to push the Ukrainians out of Sudzha. And that delayed this liberation of the Donbass, which we're currently witnessing today. I mean, this shows potentially a limit of manpower by the Russians, a limitation of equipment. Maybe there's threats of scarcity on the Russian side. However, there is still this huge advantage the Russians have. And primarily, there's two advantages. There's the parity on drones that the Russians have achieved with the Ukrainians and on the third year of the war. And this is very clear now that the Russians are, and you can see the bombings of Ukrainian cities, Lvov, Kharkov, Kiev, etc. Even Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye actually have been getting bombed very heavily, especially the industrial parts of these cities. The Russians are targeting specific locations on the outskirts of the cities, which are apparently creating these drone construction centers. And the drone warfare from Ukraine is maybe its main asset, which they're using against the Russians to push back this offensive that the SMO, essentially the progress that the SMO has been making. So it'll be very interesting to see how the Russian advance integrates, I think, long-range artillery, because we know at this point, and this is even according to Western sources, the Russians have been producing up to 2.5, maybe 3 million artillery shells per year, which are insane numbers. I mean, I don't think this many artillery shells have been produced since the Second World War. And even in Germany, they've actually announced Rheinmetall, a German huge industrial corporation, has opened up a factory which will begin producing artillery shells, German grade, obviously high quality shells for artillery that will be maybe even sent to Ukraine, but they will only be producing on an annual basis up to 350,000 shells, which is a fraction. This is a huge German industry, and only a fraction of that will be produced by the Germans. So you can kind of see the disparity. Like the Russians are producing more shells than all the other European countries combined. And of course, Ukraine domestically is probably not producing any number of shells even equivalent to the Russians. So the Russians do have a huge weapons advantage at this point. The only thing really holding back the Russians from complete success is not even the weapon shipments from the West. I would say primarily it's the Ukrainian, now domestic drone industry. So, by official standards, they have up to 2 million drones in operation. They're constantly refurbishing and sending these drones, attacking military as well as civilian targets, these oil refineries. And so I think primarily speaking, we're kind of seeing the Ukrainian war to some extent wind down. We're not seeing these huge pushes by tank forces. The Russians are mostly using quad cycles as well as motorcycles to breach Ukrainian front lines, to break communication lines down. These are obviously Spetsnaz type operations. And we're not seeing the same level of warfare that we even saw in the middle of 2023 when the Ukrainians exhausted their Abrams, Leopard, and other tank resources. Even according to Ukrainians, they've lost almost half of their Abrams tanks around Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and Pokrovsk already as of this year. So these are, of course, huge losses. The Ukrainian war really isn't going in the West's favor. And frankly speaking, I somewhat agree with Strelkov. The Russians have been using a very limited portion of their military-industrial complex in this war. They've been using their air force very conservatively. They've been using their artillery somewhat conservatively as well. Like mostly during the sieges of these major cities, where they bring up some Mariupol, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, for example. We remember the Wagner complaints that we don't have enough artillery shells, right? Which caused the entire Prigozhin revolt. And we say this because it's actually this week is the 2-year anniversary of Prigozhin's death. And we made a post in World War Now Telegram that to date, there's no official conclusion as to what exactly killed Dmitry Utkin, Prigozhin, and the other passengers of that plane that was blown up over the sky of the Tverskaya Oblast. One of these big mysteries of the special military operation in the last few years. And just looking at the Ukrainian war sort of in its context, Conrad, I somewhat agree with Steve Witkoff and Andrei Yermak, right? Who they've sat down recently this week, and Andrei Yermak has told Witkoff to his face, mind you, these are two Jewish men discussing the future of Slavic countries, which is somewhat humorous, but Andrei Yermak said, yeah, look, Russia is not looking for any negotiations. It's looking to completely push Ukraine like over the Dnieper River. And I would have to agree with Yermak here. I mean, this is Zelensky's right-hand man. He knows what's on the agenda. He knows the Russians are progressing, and the Russians are not afraid of Western aid. And this meeting of President Putin with Trump in Alaska, as you said, Conrad, it is completely for PR purposes. It was simply to somewhat delay. Imagine the smile on Putin's face as he's hearing the Russians taking all these villages surrounding Pokrovsk, entering into Pokrovsk literally days before the Alaska meeting in Anchorage. The progress is immense. It's really, if you look at 2024, besides, of course, the taking of Avdiivka, the Russians were somewhat on the back foot in Kursk. There was a huge concerns over Ukrainians breaching Russian territory in Belgorod, Bryansk, and of course, the DRG companies causing terror acts all across Russian territories. But this year, it's very much the Russians are on the offensive, and they're doing so with very limited, somewhat resources. They're not overstressing their military industrial capacity. And this, I think, is scaring these, European countries who are now really sort of overlooking their investment into NATO. I'm talking about Hungary, obviously, Slovakia. Like Fico is not an idiot. He was almost assassinated by a pro-Ukrainian. And this is why I think we're going to see a huge change in attitude. These Central European countries, they're not silly, very high IQ European people with sort of foundational Christian values who will probably see that this Eastern European expedition, in 2022, the backing of Ukraine until the last Ukrainian has been, generally speaking, a failure of NATO. And hopefully it'll end very soon. I think everyone's hoping for that, including the Ukrainians on the ground. So I somewhat have to agree with Yermak and Witkoff that the peace talks have reached almost a dead end, and Zelensky and Putin most likely will not meet until there's a ceasefire. And there won't be a ceasefire until Russia liberates a huge portion of those eastern Dnieper lands, which hopefully will come very soon.
No, I completely agree. I think at this point, Donbass is effectively secured. It's just a matter of when. And then the focus, of course, has to shift to Kherson and Zaporozhye and what we're going to do about these cities. And I think, those two cities might answer the question of is the world prepared to enter into that stage of World War III? Are we prepared for things to get a lot bloodier and the World War to get a lot more obvious? And I think potentially before Russia and Turkey happens, things might have to go down in Zaporozhye and Kherson and potentially even Odessa. So we are watching very closely, but we have to move on to discussing what's going on in the U.S. this week. And I'm not going to harp on this for too long. I think Nick Fuentes did a great breakdown of it. People have been beating it to death on either side of things, but there was, of course, the shooting at the Annunciation Catholic Church and School. It was their, I believe, all-school chapel for K through 8th grade. I was relating to this because I went through a K through 12 Christian school, so looked like something I could have been at one point, so struck close to home. But a tranny named Robert Westman, I guess they go by Robin Westman. Obviously, I'm going to be dead naming this individual, as they call it. I refuse to live by lies, but they showed up. They started shooting through the stained glass. They killed 2 kids who I believe were aged 8 and 10. This person's mother was supposedly a devout Catholic, teaches at the school, but I guess she's not cooperating with the police. I will say there's a lot of weird stuff with the mom. Everyone she knows are actors. All of her relatives are actors. I'm not implying any kind of false flag things here, but the mom and the family, there's something very weird going on there. The dad, where the Westman, potentially Jewish, name comes from, he's, very pro-trans, was obviously, I think both of them were pro-trans in some capacity. So very strange things going on. And of course, people need to pray for Sophia. I believe was she 12 or 10 or 12 or 11-year-old girl who was at the school who was shot. She's, I believe, one of the only ones still in critical condition. 2 deceased, horrible young boys. Sophia in critical condition is Orthodox. She's an Orthodox Christian who goes to a St. Mary's, a Greek church in the area, and attended the Catholic school. So pray for her, hope that she can recover fully and that this demonic action cannot claim another one of God's children. But of course, everybody making the obvious conclusion that trannies are freaks and need to be brought to heel in some capacity. One of the main things here, and again, I think Nick had a good take on this about this being evil. This isn't really a partisan thing. This isn't even necessarily about transgenderism and this, that, or the other. But something that maybe I'll do a deeper dive on, maybe we'll collaborate with Anthony of Westgate to sort of unveil this in a sort of a esoteric lore, but also a sort of breaking journalism project. Much like people have done a good job becoming sort of Epstein experts and journalists, this whole Order of the Nine Angels, 764 satanic network that is sort of emerging. It's sort of spreading through these obscure internet forums and discords and places, and these people are being groomed into these weird sort of loose networks of just chaotic demonic entities that they revel in transgenderism and all sorts of weird identity issues with sexuality. They're often, ironically, neo-Nazi, very racist. They praise a lot of supremacist killers. It's all about violence and nihilism. So they praise Dylan Roof, Brenton Tarrant, all of the racist killers, all of the other killers that maybe weren't racist, serial killers. These people are often involved in producing child pornography. These people, they do everything from school shooters to kidnapping children to rape to pedophilia to blackmail to terrorism. There's Atomwaffen division connections here. This person, for example, was writing Cyrillic, a lot of things. They apparently idolized the Crimea school shooter from, what was that, 2014, where the kid he hated religion. He was raised in like a radical Jehovah's Witnesses home, which ironically that led to Russia banning the Jehovah's Witnesses. So that's a whole other situation. But in general, this is outside of just the evil, and in many ways we live in a lower violent society in the West. So I think the devil has to focus in on demented, isolated people and then turn them into sort of vectors of killing and violence to disrupt the peace that has sort of begrudgingly sort of descended upon the West. Unfortunately, I think we might have to be doing a deeper dive on this network that's growing it's the sort of satanic, esoteric, neo-Nazi, as much as I hate to say that, it is real there, pedophile, transgender sort of cult, this pagan connection. It was big in the UK for a while back in the day. I know it's big in certain sects in Russia, and it's becoming this worldwide thing. And right now it's the biggest in the United States. And you hear a lot about this of just weird people who either get caught or killed they were in some group of weird people living in some house about to commit some heinous crime, and they all end up shooting each other or some other sordid story, or they get caught with child pornography, or one of them gets caught with a minor, or one of them shoots the other one, or one of them gets overdoses on drugs. It's just these people that are absolutely the dregs of society, the bottom of the barrel, people that have fallen through the cracks and then some, through the internet and through, the aerial waves as they were in their demonic, the demonic actors within them. These sort of super predators are emerging that at any moment could commit an act of terrorism or a school shooting or just be sort of terrorizing a community in any sort of evil demonic way. So as much as it's going to be sordid, it might be worth diving into this so people can be aware of it, and so potentially we can get to the bottom of certain things and make it very clear that this is a spiritual war that we are in, and it's only going to get more and more obvious. But unfortunately, the beast system is only going to get worse here, because we already have Palantir type, AI surveillance entrepreneurs going on Fox News saying that if their Gideon AI threat detection platform built for law enforcement had launched a week earlier than it was supposed to, it would have stopped this shooting. According to this guy, it scrapes the internet 24/7 using Israeli-grade ontology. What the hell does that mean? I think he maybe just misspoke and meant technology, but Owen Cyclops quote tweeted this. He's saying, it scrapes the internet using Israeli-grade ontology. Is that like Kabbalah? Are the police going to use gematria on me? Which, unfortunately, that sounds like exactly what's going to happen. And you have my attorney general here in Texas who's running for the Senate, who usually I like, but he's, pining for Jewish money. So he is going after anti-Semites, doing the whole anti-Semitic investigation in these school systems for teachers that are being pro-Palestine. We, of course, have more and more crackdowns on Ivy League schools, all these other anti-Semitism task forces. Remember the FEMA situation and all these other, we've heard all about the boycott and the anti-BDS legislation that has been obviously violating the First Amendment. And now we're about to be entering into the Israeli Gideon. It's literally called Gideon as the Gideon's Chariot operation is ongoing in Gaza. I think that's no coincidence, but we're in the Gideon panopticon where sure, you can be a troon, you can be a homo, you can watch as much porn as you want, but if you start talking against Israel, the morality police is going to show up and give you 40 lashes, or they're just going to disappear you in a van. I don't know what they're going to do with you, but that is unfortunately the reality of the situation that we are in right now. But I don't want to harp on that for too long, Dimitri, but I would love your thoughts on this school shooting. I did think the weird Russia-Crimea shooter connection was interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that most of this fellow's Russian that was in his notebook and his suicide notes, and obviously on his firearms that he clearly depicted certain Russian words. They had like crazy spelling mistakes. And also most of the letters were capitalized, and regular Russians either write in cursive or they write sort of in regular font without this bizarre. I mean, the spelling mistakes were so obvious. Certain letters were simply in the wrong places. Clearly that he just copied it off of either an AI or Google Translate, or perhaps the words didn't really make sense. And it's very bizarre that he had this obsession with the Russian language. And it's very clear, like he was trying to use grammatical rules, but clearly he had no proper education in this particular theme. I think it was almost, and the messaging here in this particular realm from this character, it is quite schizophrenic. I think it's very clear this person was deeply disturbed. There's claims from official American sources that he was an anti-Semite. He was mentioning the Holocaust and all these other events, and clearly, it was a multi-pronged obsession that he had, or perhaps maybe even this was a psyop of certain, like in the journal, you can clearly see he had certain involvements with the occult. I think most of these mass shootings, including Breivik himself, the infamous shooter in the 2000s who killed, I believe it was between 60 and 70 Muslims in Norway. If you recall the Breivik shooting in Norway, which was probably one of the most serious sort of terror acts you saw in the Scandinavian countries, Breivik himself, the initial posturing was that, he was a Christian, he was trying to prevent the replacement of Europeans. And then it came out that he was also a member of a Masonic lodge. So I wonder what exactly will come out about this individual, or what won't come out about him, about his family connections, what kind of ideological presuppositions he had. But he was clearly involved with some very dark themes. I mean, a lot of people gave insight into the demonic depictions he had in his particular journal. Clearly a very disturbed individual. But I'll also counter what those Fox News talk people stated, Conrad, very clearly. Like they're claiming that this AI technology would prevent these terror acts from taking place domestically on US soil. And this Israeli technology is the same thing that apparently did not prevent the October 7th attack, right? Just a few years ago. So what claims of success can we really have here? And I mean, Israel at the moment is obviously in a driving position, pushing American censorship, claiming anti-Semitism, claiming that most of these attacks, and this fellow drove past like several synagogues as well. And he chose specifically a Catholic church. And I have to say, I think there was somewhat of a miraculous salvation moment. The Pews, of course, defended many of the kids. Many of them are still injured, but having only 2 casualties, and this guy was armed to the teeth, is, I think, a huge miracle. So glory to God for actually protecting these children from the attack. I just think it's quite horrible. And clearly, anyone claiming that this was an anti-Semite, of course, attacking a Roman Catholic Church, I think this is completely inappropriate. But looking generally upon just the 20th century, one of the main symptoms, I think, from the Second World War onwards, is we see the rise of psychopathic mass murderers, school shooters, etc. This is a symptom of this new post-1917 catacomb-less world that we live in. We see just a complete deterioration of the human condition. A lot of, even in the Soviet Union, which was renowned for its mass murderers, not necessarily school shooters, but just direct serial killers. Like in the article we covered, Shekinah's Chariot on the Substack, there was clearly an increase both in the USSR and in the US of these absolutely crazed individuals who had most of the time ties to some very dark occultic groups. And this is not something that we ever saw in the 19th century. Not even going to mention Jack the Ripper as like an exclusion here. So this is clearly something that has been pushed onto Western majority white, majority Christian foundational societies from without. So it'll be very interesting to see. We'll make sure to cover it with Anthony of Westgate in detail in our coming 8th hour.
Yeah, talking to Anthony is always great. And I think you mentioned the notebook, and you just mentioned that, there was literally a picture of him looking in the mirror and a demon like looking back at him. So this clearly, demonic forces were at work here. So we have to pray. And again, we have to this is the sort of thing that, as much as it pains one to say, where if this is the reality that we live in, where this is, spirits are just running wild and we're susceptible to them and these sorts of things occur, I think a third world war is merciful. And I think that's something that, if it's going to be like this, then it would be best if something like that comes, as much as I hate to say that, and as much as, I don't say that as someone hoping to escape consequences and others, experience them. That's just, we all live in this world. And I think that's the direction things are going. But moving on here, we're getting to the end of the show and we still have a decent amount to talk about. So got to hop to it. A big announcement, I think, not too much on the Venezuela front, but this was so crazy that, I think we have to talk about it. Caroline Leavitt said that it's up to Trump alone to decide, and every element of U.S. power to stop drugs is on the table, including potential strikes directly on Maduro in Venezuela. And Maduro is now being regularly referred to as the head of a cartel, the Cartel de los Soles, which is supposedly this transnational Venezuelan-centered drug operation, which I'm sure there's some truth to it. I don't really know all of the details, but I'm not going to believe the United States State Department 100%, that is for sure. But it's clear that, with the massive amount of destroyers, submarines, I believe it's 4,500 plus soldiers, naval soldiers on these boats off the coast of Venezuela right now, it's clear that the U.S. is trying to make good on that threat that Republicans have been making, that by the end of 2025, Maduro will be out of power. So we're going to be seeing how that goes. We saw a bit of a kerfuffle in the Mexican Senate as over the issue of U.S. strikes on drug cartels. The opposition party, who obviously are going to be more pro-U.S. as a left-wing, party is currently in power, anti-U.S. party led by their Jewish president is in power right now. That party accused the opposition of supporting the U.S. strikes due to being, more pro-U.S. And then a member of the other party started slapping this other guy. Shows right now in Mexico, the discourse is very much surrounding the U.S. war on the cartels, these drones that are flying deep into Mexico. Obviously, it's going to be tied into what's going on in Venezuela right now, looking at what's happening over there. So we are going to be watching this Monroe Doctrine, this new war going on in the South very closely. We've heard rumors that, sometimes people have tried to tie Hezbollah in Iran to these cartels. I always thought that was a little bit silly, but hey, if things start to heat up in the Middle East between America, Israel, and Iran, which I'm sure they will, who knows what will happen. But unless you have anything to say about South America, Dimitri, which I don't think there's anything else to really discuss, we should definitely discuss Africa. And the main story I have from Africa, of course, is from Goodrow Online. It says, U.S. reaffirms support for one Somalia policy, dismisses talks on Somalia recognition. The United States is not in any formal discussions geared towards recognition of the northern state of Somalia, Somaliland, despite existing calls by several stakeholders, including Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who is pushing for the agenda. A State Department spokesperson told Fox News that there were no engagements for recognition of Somaliland, noting that the U.S. supports a single Somalia policy where emphasis is put on respect towards Somalia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It goes on to just extend the statement. I'm really wondering if something changed, because for the longest time, the State Department was very much signaling that it was moving in the Ted Cruz direction and was going to recognize Somaliland. And I very much thought that was going to be about moving the Palestinians somewhere else. But between this and, Tom Barak's statement, maybe certain powers are getting a little bit tired of the Likud line on things, or they've just found a different place to put the Palestinians and, are trying to get closer with Turkey. Because, for example, Turkey supports United Somalia, and Donald Trump recently Donald Trump is very close with Turkey. He considers Turkey a close ally, and he talks about how they need to become a better ally. So I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes Trump would do things more in Turkish interests, even if, certain people are already pushing for Somaliland. But I'd love to hear anything else you have to say in Africa, Dimitri. I know the Sahel is somewhat back in the news again, as well as a few other stories before we talk about Asia.
Yes, of course. The Somaliland situation is very interesting because we've had weeks of, Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, of course, hyper-Zionist. He's, of course, the Foreign Relations Subcommittee chairman in America on Africa, actually, so specializing on the region. He kept emphasizing the need for an independent Somaliland. And then just this week, literally a few days ago, the Trump administration pushed back, said, no, we have no plan. So yes, absolutely. It's a balancing act between, obviously, the actual country of Somalia, which is heavily pro-Turkish, and some sort of Gulf of Aden, a Red Sea American outpost down there in the south. So it's very interesting to sort of see those discussions. And again, Somaliland, who exactly will that benefit? Ethiopia, or is that more pro-Israeli? There's a lot of very diverse discourse in that region, which we honestly have spoken about for over a year at this point. But interestingly enough, moving a bit to the west, in Libya, there's been a huge international scandal in the Mediterranean. So, of course, there was a rescue vessel actually trying to save refugees who were drowning in the Mediterranean just off the Libyan coast, over 40 nautical miles, which is about 70 or so kilometers away from Libya, the Ocean Viking, SOS Mediterranean rescue vessel. And it was trying to actually pick up these refugees, Conrad, and take them to Europe, right? These are African sub-Saharans who simply, get into these inflatable boats. And these NGOs, of course, provide all this equipment for them to cross the Mediterranean and illegally get into Europe seeking asylum for whatever reason. But the Ocean Viking NGO rescue ship was attacked by the Libyan Coast Guard, and they were attacked with live fire weapons. So this isn't like the Philippines, Chinese debacles we saw in the South China Sea when we had essentially them shooting water at one another. No, this was actually live fire. Fortunately, nobody died, but the attack lasted about 20 minutes. The Libyan Coast Guard was yelling in Arabic over a loudspeaker, yelling, "We will come and we will kill you all if you do not stop." So the Libyan National Coast Guard treating the refugee asylum seeker crisis into you very seriously. And mind you, this is probably the second big story. And this ship, of course, abandoned all of its efforts as soon as it was getting shot at. It left certain refugees in the water and then, of course, headed back to Europe. So this entire operation was a failure. Yes, most likely some refugees drowned, but we have to sort of thank the Libyans and the Libyan government for somewhat defending Europe from sort of the great replacement Kalugi plan taking place with all these, of course, shipments of non-Europeans over the Mediterranean, as harsh as it may seem. And this is the second story that we've heard from Libya sort of mistreating refugees. If you recall, in February of this year, there was a mass grave between 50 and 100 bodies of refugees, sub-Saharans, found in this big pit in the East Libyan desert. So this is just to the east of the Sahara Desert, which apparently, according to them, maybe it was Marshal Haftar's men simply shot these people and buried them out there in the sand. So yeah, Libya is not a safe place. My recommendation would be, if you're an African asylum seeker, right? It's not Mexico. Libya is not a transitional zone for you to simply cross over. Perhaps it's better to remain in your respective African countries. And look, we can all say this, but of course, there's nations such as Sudan, just south of Libya, which has been war-torn for so long at this point that, yes, we can kind of understand the desperation of these people seeking refuge abroad, but there's a reason why they're heading to Europe, and it's the infinite benefits. And you can see the Prime Minister of Italy, actually, Giorgia Meloni, she hasn't even commented on this event from the 24th of August, the Libyan Coast Guard essentially almost committing like a war crime, drowning an international NGO vessel. So very interesting. And just heading like westwards, there's more sort of international disputes. We mentioned last week how Wagner officials and Russian military officials have blamed Mauritania for arming and assisting jihadi Salafists as well as Tuareg rebels who are stationed on Mauritanian soil, training them and then allowing them to cross into Mali, which is a Russian allied country, along with Burkina Faso now. We can probably officially say this. And of course, Mauritania, just like for context, it is a 99.9% Muslim country. They have Sharia law completely integrated into their legal system. There's almost no Christians there. There is a very small, very wealthy Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jewish elite in Mauritania, which is very interesting. They hold sort of high positions, not spoken about very often, as mostly, these things are not. They're kind of held in the shadows. And so Mauritania, I would say, very similar to Afghanistan. The border is more or less a free-for-all zone. These rebels, a similar way to, if you recall, in Afghanistan, the Taliban would cross from Pakistan into Afghanistan at will whilst they were fighting the Soviets and the Americans. And they were using Pakistan as essentially a formation base for their radical Islamist groups. The same thing Mauritania is doing. And it shares a 2,200 kilometer, that is 1.4 thousand kilometer border with Mali. So that's a huge amount of land, mostly, of course, unmanned, no border security whatsoever. You can simply cross the desert if you have the resource to do so. So I think Mauritania, of course, denying that they're assisting Tuareg and Janim, which was the main Salafist radical, basically ISIS of the Sahel. Mauritania really, their cries of disrespect against Russia are really falling on deaf ears. Well, I think we really clearly know that Mauritania here at the moment is supporting this radical Islamist takeover of the Sahel region, and they're really supporting these groups. I mean, it's really a no-brainer at this point. If anything, Conrad, we see these mostly moderate Muslim countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, right, which actually somewhat respect their Christian populations, trying to fight off the more radicalized West Coast former French colonial nations who are funding these very interesting ISIS groups. And generally speaking, I think this conflict, we have heard of Wagner officially sort of leaving Mali. I think this is one of those conflict zones that will continue to develop and probably get a lot more serious, because we haven't heard of much Malian success. And Burkina Faso, there's still conflict taking place on their borders. The countries are not in a state of civil war, but there are groups operating within the nations that would potentially, the image that kind of, if you look at a map of Mali and Burkina Faso today, you'll kind of see an almost like Russian Civil War-esque layout where you have these zones controlled by groups. It's not quite in the same vein as, say, Myanmar, which is very heavily divided and the battling in the jungle is super intense. But still, there's a lot of places where you simply do not go in Mali or Burkina Faso because there's actual Salafists, head choppers over there. So very interesting that Mauritania, and look, the Russians have been disrespecting Mauritania quite a bit this week, Conrad, because of these comments. In fact, they've done a sort of analysis of Mauritania, and it appears that in Mauritania, it's the last country on earth which still has slavery, which is somewhat legalized. In fact, you can buy a Mauritanian black slave for between $200 and $2,000 American dollars over there. And they will serve you as your serf. They'll work on your farm, in your business, and they'll have almost no rights whatsoever. Men, women, depending on beauty, age, physical condition, it's one of the only countries where allegedly between 10 and 20% of the population are officially or unofficially, but still on paper, literally in a state of slavery. And so we can kind of see this particular Sharia regime still operating in Northwest Africa. Notice how NATO is not interested in intervening, they're not interested in regime change in this particular country. The two-faced approach to battling terrorism, how the West approaches it, is very obvious with countries like Mauritania, because look, Mauritania is doing somewhat of a good thing. They're destabilizing Mali and Burkina Faso, who are evil allies of Russia and China. So of course we can kind of close our eyes on that from a Western globalist perspective. And that's Africa, a constant place of unfortunate warfare between various very major powers. And a lot of African nations are simply proxies for greater powers from abroad.
No, that's exactly right. And that's a good way to round out Africa. And we're moving on to Asia. And of course, the big news from Asia is China's upcoming massive victory parade in the victory in their war over Japan, with World War II, the Sino-Japanese War, the whole kit and caboodle there that, eventually then led to the Korean War and all that stuff. But generally speaking, this is another one of those multipolar moments, and it's also going to be coinciding with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which I've always maintained is actually more relevant than BRICS. I think it's more likely to become, in sort of maybe a more military or economic way, maybe what BRICS people think it's going to be. So SCO is very relevant. And of course, those leaders that have been invited are likely to attend this big parade in China. You've got, of course, Xi Jinping himself will be there, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, of course, the presidents of Central Asia, Masoud Pezeshkian in Iran is going to be there, all the STAN countries. You've got some of these more communist countries in Africa, Zimbabwe, the Congo, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar. These leaders are going to be attending the parade. Then they'll be in Tianjin for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which has been ongoing every year since 2001. So big escalations in the multipolar world, with China and Russia ever continuing to move closer. And I think, again, this parade, we're also seeing a whole lot of leaks and information and news about new Chinese weapons that are going to be put on display. Beijing is really being militarized and made good for this parade. So I think this is going to be interesting to watch. Obviously, unfortunately for Trump, I think this parade is going to be a lot more impressive and disciplined than his attempt at a military parade, which sort of turned into a meme. But we eventually have to move on to church news here, Dimitri. But unless you have anything to say about this parade, obviously, I believe Aliyev and a bunch of other Central Asian leaders have been invited. We're not 100% sure who's going to be attending. I think the countries I read right before this were generally who had already accepted the invitation, but I guess we'll see who attends.
Yeah, no, I think generally it'll be a good opportunity for Middle Eastern leaders. Certain African leaders no doubt will attend, Southeast Asian leaders as well, especially in light of what took place between Cambodia, Thailand. I think China sends out these broad waves of invitations, and Central Asians as well. I have no doubt perhaps Tokayev will be there, as well as the president of Uzbekistan. So it'll be a good opportunity for all these leaders to meet in person, hopefully with some sort of privacy available so they can discuss economic as well as political international relations discourse without, the official diplomatic visits that are typically required for such things. So generally speaking, we're all looking forward to that big parade. Apparently, it'll be much larger than even the 9th of May parade, which took place in Moscow this year, the official celebration of the 80-year end of the Second World War, which, again, the Russians invited many other countries to, and even Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority leader, was there as well. So very interesting to see exactly what will happen. And moving on to church news, there's some crazy stuff that has been taking place in Ukraine, which really, I think, cements what we've been talking about from the beginning of the show, which is that the Ukrainian government really is anti-Orthodox in its essence and in most of its conduct, not just via the persecution, but in what it essentially is promoting. So on Sunday, the 25th of August, it was officially, the 24th of August, so Sunday, on Sunday, the 24th of August, it was officially the Independence Day of Ukraine. And on Monday, the 25th, there was a huge celebration in Ukraine. In fact, they had one of the halls outside of the Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. This is, by the way, an occupied cathedral in Ukraine. So just keep in mind, it was Orthodox Christian at one point, currently occupied by Epifany Dumenko. Zelensky loves to take footage of the cathedral in the background, clearly so positioning himself as a supporter of Christian values in Ukraine, which we know is a complete bluff. But in this particular breakfast hall, a Protestant pastor gave this breakfast in an American style, this breakfast sermon in which he said, "All right, let's all arise before we eat together and let us pray in the old Jewish tradition." And he starts just it's really bizarre prayer. It's not the Lord's Prayer, but some sort of quasi-Protestant, Old Testament inspired, very weird. He said things such as, "Almighty God, defend Ukraine and its independence. We're all gathered here today." And he referred to God as al-Sharaa, very interesting, just taking these Old Testament names of our Lord, simply proclaiming them in vain. And the people seated there, of course, you have members of various Ukrainian Protestant communities, the Ukrainian Evangelical Church, Seventh-day Adventists, the Ukrainian Bible Society, so Baptists. You had Roman Catholics as well, unfortunately. The Roman Catholic Bishop Vitaly Krivitsky was there. You had even Muslims who were all joined together in this prayer. And the breakfast wasn't just the only, of course, abhorrent act which took place in Ukraine this weekend. There was also a huge prayer service, an ecumenical prayer service in the occupied St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. And this was really bad because you had both Zelensky and his wife there who are not Christian. You also had the prayer being led by Epifany Dumenko. This is the OCU hierarch, Sergei, the same man who was endorsed and who was given the Tomos by Patriarch Bartholomew. So this is a big, I think, humiliation for the EP that his particular people are engaged in this. They had a huge joint prayer led by Epifany, and the participants, you had the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, you had the Roman Catholic Diocese of Kiev and Zhytomyr, which is a completely different Roman Catholic jurisdiction. You had two different top Muslim imams, one from Crimea and one from just generally in Ukraine. You had at least 10 different Protestant denomination pastors, like these are the heads of various Protestant sects in Ukraine. You had two chief rabbis, the head of the Jewish Religious Organization of Ukraine, Rabbi Blech, and you had, of course, Rabbi Osman present as well. So you had little Talmudic rabbis in the St. Sophia Cathedral praying alongside Epifany Dumenko, Bishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk, the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and all these Protestant pastors and Islamic leaders. And they all prayed with Zelensky for the strengthening of Ukraine and for Ukrainian independence on this solemn day in their understanding. Fortunately enough, and this is a huge blessing, that not a single representative of the UOC, the Canonical Orthodox Church of Metropolitan Onufry, was present in that desecrated place. And this is huge, because notice before, Metropolitan Onufry tried to always approach, domestic politics within Ukraine from a very amicable position. But here we see that not even a deacon, not a priest, not even the most ecumenist bishop attended this particular meeting of lawlessness in a once holy place of Ukraine, which is, kudos to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for maintaining degrees of separation from this act of transgression. And unfortunately, I think for any Orthodox Christians who are still supporting this Ukrainian regime, hopefully this act of ecumenism really will show you as to whose side Zelensky is on. For this apparent ephemeral victory that he wishes to have over Russia, he's willing to have rabbis, Muslim imams, Roman Catholic bishops, and all these various Protestant pastors pray together to some sort of amorphous architect of the universe. So very interesting as to how all of this will align in the heads of certain people who are still supportive of Ukraine from apparently like an Eastern Orthodox Christian position. And another very interesting thing is there was a statement recently by Patriarch Bartholomew who actually condemned what the Israelis were doing in Gaza, first and foremost, which we have to praise him for. And secondly, he also said that the Ukrainian-Russian war is a very unfortunate act. He didn't actually blame Russia. He said that it was a brotherly war, almost a civil war. And this sort of statement by Patriarch Bartholomew, it almost took me by surprise, because normally, he's always speaking out about Russian aggression. But here he just says that the entire world is headed into a very unfortunate situation. There's conflicts happening everywhere, regions with people who want peace being completely desecrated, the church is being attacked. Patriarch Bartholomew almost having like an enlightenment moment for himself. And I think most of the time, Conrad, there's probably people within the EP who force really bad opinions upon this very elderly and sick hierarch of the ecumenical patriarchate, the leader of their church. And sometimes I think God, through the Holy Spirit, really just acts upon him and really enlightens him as to what exactly is taking place. He needs to be a spokesperson for the needy, the peace-loving people around the world, in the Church of Antioch, the Church of Jerusalem, the Greeks, even the Turkish people who are currently suffering, and the Turkish people who are unable to convert to Orthodox Christianity because of the current regime position there. And of course, the Ukrainians and the Russians suffering. Patriarch Bartholomew could have been this real neutral party who maybe could have even participated in some of the peace talks. But unfortunately, he tainted his own legacy by coming out in support of the Zelensky regime early on. I think even during the time of the Maidan, when he supported Poroshenko, but yes, definitely the Zelensky regime from 2019 onwards. And it's just very unfortunate, Conrad, because once the persecution develops and becomes more extreme, nobody will come to Patriarch Bartholomew and seek his guidance because of some of his misdeeds. And this is one of the saddest things. But on more optimistic news, there's been some huge Orthodox Christian processions for the feast day of the Dormition of the Theotokos across Ukraine, and specifically in the cities of Kamenets-Podolsk and Pachayev. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians gathered to walk along these processions during the liturgy. It was a really festive event. And fortunately enough, the Ukrainians were not snatching people out of the procession and dragging them into these vans, even though there were threats that the Ukrainian Tzk officials would be stationed there. And in a very similar way, to sort of mirror those pious Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, Patriarch Kirill has announced a huge procession for the first time since the COVID pandemic, a procession which most likely will include hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Christians, and mostly Russians, to walk in Moscow after the liturgy on the 7th of September. So the 7th of September is going to be a huge day in Russia. There's going to be amazing footage. We'll make sure to post all about it on our Telegram and our Twitter page. There'll be the Patriarch Kirill himself will be leading it, many other Russian bishops. Most likely it'll even eclipse the huge procession in St. Petersburg that took place earlier this year, as well as the procession in Yekaterinburg for the memory of Tsar Nicholas II. And this is the first time in Moscow that the mayor of Moscow and the Russian government has sanctioned, because of the COVID regime, unfortunately, in Russia, these sort of things were not possible, especially in the capital of the Russian Federation. But now Patriarch Kirill has, I think, openly received permission to organize such a massive procession with people carrying crosses and icons just in the center of Moscow. So this is a huge event on the 7th of September that will take place, I think, maybe even more important, honestly, than the 9th of May. This will show a real spiritual mobilization. That's what they're calling it. They're calling it a spiritual mobilization of the Russian people in prayer, praying for peace, praying for Russian victory over the persecutors of the church. It'll be a huge spiritually uplifting moment for the Russians and for all Orthodox Christians who participate in that. So I'm very grateful that Patriarch Kirill, and look, I think he's influenced positively many of Russian politicians, including Sergei Lavrov, Maria Zakharova, like all of these figures of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They've been mentioning the persecution of the church in Ukraine, which is something they haven't done for the first 1.5, maybe 2 years of the conflict. And now, because Patriarch Kirill has been just constantly hammering home the point that spiritual independence and freedom of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Metropolitan Onufry is a vital point of importance for all Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe, it's finally been noticed. And hopefully this procession on the 7th of September, it'll go safe. Hopefully the Russian FSB and the counter-terrorist groups will keep everybody safe, and they'll allow for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians to proceed in peace and in prayer along the Third Rome streets. So this is quite a wonderful event, I think, that has been scheduled in Moscow.
No, I very much agree. And as far as what you mentioned about Patriarch Bartholomew, I agree. I think, I've always been reticent to say that all this globo homo nonsense is always his personal opinion, but unfortunately, it doesn't matter if it is or it isn't. He signed off on this. He created the schism, and it's nice that he says this now, but it would have been great if he was saying this a few years ago before this war started, because, his ascent, with the help of Mike Pompeo was, maybe it wouldn't have been enough to not cause it to happen, but it definitely was a relevant domino in the, domino effect that led to the war and everything going on today. So the fact that he has been in power for so long, I mean, who knows what the world will look like when he is no longer the Patriarch of Constantinople, what that will lead to, what new leadership in that position will look like. He's been the Patriarch since 1991. He's one of the longest serving bishops in the history of Orthodoxy, longest serving patriarchs, he's beat out most popes. He's been, 4 popes now he's been bishop during. You've got John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, and now Pope Leo. Patriarch Bartholomew's outlived them all. So who knows what will happen when when the Green Patriarch, as he styled himself, will repose. There's prophecies about him getting beheaded by Turks. So, who knows what's going to happen? But I don't talk about those as confidently as I talk about other things on the show. But speaking of church persecutions, this is from Ortho Christian. Greek Orthodox Patriarchate bank accounts in Jerusalem reportedly unfrozen. So this is good news. The bank accounts of the Jerusalem Patriarchate have been unfrozen, according to an exclusive report from Greek church news agency Romfea, marking a significant development in the ongoing property tax dispute with Israeli authorities. The accounts have been frozen by the Jerusalem municipality on the 6th of August over unpaid property taxes known as Arnona, the Israeli property tax collected throughout the city. The freeze left the Patriarchate unable to pay salaries to clergy, teachers, and staff. According to Romfea's exclusive information, the matter has reached a positive outcome in recent days following various interventions. The agency reports the intense pressure from consuls general of various countries ultimately led to the release of the accounts. The report notes that all Christian churches and communities in Jerusalem stood united on this issue, jointly raising their voices against the municipality's decision and defending their historic rights in the Holy City. I hope that Russia and Greece were involved in that. I wouldn't be surprised if they were, those consuls at least that it was talking about. It goes on, the dispute centers on which church properties are exempt from municipal taxes, with the Jerusalem municipality asserting that tax exemptions apply only to properties used for worship and religious teaching, not commercial activities serving pilgrims. The Middle East Council of Churches had issued a statement against the freezing of accounts by the occupation authorities, adding to the chorus of opposition from Christian institutions. The current dispute dates back to 2018 when Jerusalem began seeking to collect back taxes from church properties. A similar freeze from that year prompted religious authorities to shut down the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for 3 days in protest, with the municipality backing down only after intervention from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is good news. Clearly, international pressure mounted and the Israelis somewhat caved. Look, they have a lot to lose at this point. They can't afford to lose much more goodwill. So it's good to press them on these sorts of things because they might cave, because they recognize that if they lose too much more popularity, next thing you know, when the missiles start flying, people will look the other way. Or in my case, look happily on and clap and cheer. But moving on to our final story here, a classic Athonite protest against the modern world. We have Elder Parthenios of Mount Athos warns against Greece's personal ID number system, is also from Ortho Christian. Elder Parthenios, abbot of St. Paul's Monastery in Mount Athos, one of the Holy Mountain's most beloved spiritual guides, has issued a stern warning to Orthodox Christians against accepting Greece's new personal identification number, calling it illegal and demonic. In a recorded message to his spiritual children, the elder declares that what the state is doing is illegal because it's not spiritual, and they're not spiritual people to direct the church. The church is directed by our Lord Jesus Christ. He is the head of the church. This matter of identity concerns us Christians unbearably because we are baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, and we are chrismated. We are children of the church, children of God. Elder Parthenios states, and how dare they do this thing, wanting to put codes on us, etc., dark things, and an identity card whose contents we don't know. The elder urges the faithful not to rush to obtain the personal number, emphasizing the Christian understanding of personhood. We're not atoms, we're Christians in the name of the triune God, and numbers and such things won't save us. The body and blood of Christ saves us. So it goes on. It's a very quotable article, and of course he's hearkening many of the saints of the 20th century who warned against the ID cards. In particular, St. Paisios very much warned against the cards and told Greek people to go as long as they can go without getting the cards. So the fact that Greece just goes forward anyway shows you how far some of these countries that produce some of the greatest saints, unfortunately, large majorities and pluralities of these countries don't care what the saints said at all. So, Dimitri, I know you read this story as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it if you had any good quotes from Elder Parthenios for us as we land this plane.
Yeah, first and foremost, I just want to say that many Russian hierarchs, including Russian saints, first and foremost, the former patriarch of St. Petersburg during the 1990s. He was most of the time seen as the most conservative Russian hierarch of the 1990s. Many people think that he was maybe poisoned or even assassinated, because he did die before his time. That is, of course, Metropolitan Jan Snitchev of St. Petersburg. So one of a very important hierarch. He also mentioned, just as Elder Parthenios here, the dangers of these electronic identification cards and numbers. He said it was a precursor to the mark of the beast system being implemented in Christian countries. So it's almost aligning the prophecies and the clairvoyant predictions of Russian elders and hierarchs with those of the Greeks, warnings. And Elder Parthenios, he very clearly, he just said that, look, tomorrow they'll tell us they will create a cashless society, but Christ didn't create a cashless society. He helped free us, each one to think and decide and act. All these things are demonic and tempting. They're atheist people. These are from Masonic lodges. We must confess the time has come. We're in the years of the apocalypse. He's, of course, speaking about the Greek government being majority, probably Freemasons, most of them being, of course, led by non-Christian principles. And we would have to agree. And clearly we saw this at the beginning of 2024 when Greece legalized gay marriage. This was like the pinnacle of degeneracy in an Orthodox Christian country, completely unprecedented. So Elder Parthenios, we just have to say that he's completely on the money here. His view of what's taking place in Orthodox Christian countries, especially in the Mediterranean, completely aligns with those of Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu. And we have to stand behind these particular elders because, look, they don't have a lot of, shall we say, institutional support. A lot of the big hierarchs, leaders, those around the Archbishop of Athens or Patriarch Bartholomew, members of the Synod, they don't necessarily support these figures who actually speak out against the encroaching technological totalitarian system, which will eventually develop. And most likely, these are all prototypical attempts at trying to implement the mark of the beast system, which will take away human free will, and according to the Orthodox Christian saints, will prevent us from freely worshiping God. I mean, unfortunately, this is that Neuralink style system, which I think Elon Musk is currently experimenting with, trying to portray it as a solution to help disabled people with people who've suffered from strokes, etc. But I think, absolutely know where this will go. And once the ball starts rolling, these societies, which are dominated by, as Elder Parthenius says, people from Masonic lodges, they will push the envelope and they will bring about that same system, which eventually the Antichrist will most likely culminate and try to implement over the countries which he controls towards the end of the world. So not to be too fear-mongering here, but I think trusting this elder here, the government of Greece very clearly is still occupied. We just have to make sure we reiterate that point.
No, very true. And Elder Parthenios, probably one of, if not the current, greatest living elders on Manastos. So he's definitely somebody worth listening to. But we are well over the time limit here. So thank you all so much for listening, tuning in to the end of this World War Now episode. This is our weekly news show. So tune in next week. This is the weekly coverage of the ongoing Third World War as we understand it as best we can. So be sure to subscribe at worldwarnow.co. That's how you can get behind the paywall, get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes. We released our economic analysis episode with Gennady this week, where we discussed the economic looting of Ukraine, the oligarchs behind it, Russia's economic shift towards China, and the future of Eastern Europe, its natural resources, and generally the economy of that region and how it will affect the Third World War. So get behind the paywall, check that out. It's really fantastic episode. We've got the Q&A episode coming up soon. We recorded that, so stand by for that. It's going to be released shortly. Some very good questions, but be sure to follow us on X at WorldWarNow_. Follow me at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're watching on YouTube, like the video. Really helps us out. Leave a comment, share. Obviously, if you're on Substack, please like. It really helps us out. We want to get those over 50 likes on Substack every time at least. Leave a comment as well. It helps with the engagement, and share, restack. Restacks are just as important. I need to be telling people to restack. And if you're listening and you don't have the Substack app, please download the Substack app so it helps you, so you can like and you can comment and do all of these things. And there's all sorts of great stuff on the Substack app. You've got Anthony, you've got the Reversion, everything he's doing. Father Peter is on there. All sorts of great Substacks. So really get on there, some good Orthodox stuff. And again, follow us on X at WorldWarNow_. Follow us on Telegram at WorldWarNowTelly. That's our 24-hour news feed where we stay up to date on everything. If you want to talk to Dimitri and I on a more regular basis, join the World War Now Discord server. The link is going to be down in the description below. We've got all sorts of channels to discuss cosmology, prophecies, the conflict in Russia, the conflict in the Middle East, the conflicts in Asia, Orthodoxy, Orthodox ecclesiology in America, Lives of the Saints, chats for all sorts of stuff, voice channels and everything. So check out the Discord, worldwarnow.co. Get behind the paywall. It keeps the lights on here at the World War Now bunker. Helps supports the show, and you get access to hundreds and hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content. So thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.